Book Second, Chapter 6 of The Hunchback of Notre Dame, by Victor Hugo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book Second, Chapter 6 The Broken Jug. After having run for some time at the top of his speed, without knowing whither, knocking his head against many a street corner, leaping many a gutter, traversing many an alley, many a court, many a square, seeking flight and passage through all the meanderings of the ancient passages of the Halles, exploring in his panic terror what the fine Latin of the maps calls tota via, caminum et viaria, our poet suddenly halted for lack of breath in the first place, and in the second because he had been collared, after a fashion, by a dilemma which had just occurred to his mind. "It strikes me, Master Pierre Gringoire," he said to himself, placing his finger to his brow, "that you are running like a madman. The little scamps are no less afraid of you than you are of them. It strikes me, I say, that you heard the clatter of their wooden shoes fleeing southward, while you were fleeing northward. Now, one of two things. Either they have taken flight, and the pallet, which they must have forgotten in their terror, is precisely that hospitable bed in search of which you have been running ever since morning, and which Madame the Virgin miraculously sends you in order to recompense you for having made a morality in her honor, accompanied by triumphs and mummeries. Or the children have not taken flight, and in that case they have put the brand to the pallet, and that is precisely the good fire which you need to cheer, dry, and warm you. In either case, good fire or good bed, that straw pallet is a gift from heaven. The Blessed Virgin Marie, who stands at the corner of the Rue Mauconseil, could only have made Eustache Maubin die for that express purpose. And it is folly on your part to flee thus zigzag, like a Picard before a Frenchman, leaving behind you what you seek before you, and you are a fool." Then he retraced his steps, and feeling his way and searching, with his nose to the wind and his ears on the alert, he tried to find the blessed pallet again, but in vain. There was nothing to be found but intersections of houses, closed courts, and crossings of streets, in the midst of which he hesitated and doubted incessantly, being more perplexed and entangled in this medley of streets than he would have been even in the labyrinth of the Hôtel du Tournelle. At length he lost patience, and exclaimed solemnly, "Cursed be cross-roads! 'Tis the devil who has made them in the shape of his pitchfork." This exclamation afforded him a little solace, and a sort of reddish reflection which he caught sight of at that moment, at the extremity of a long and narrow lane, completed the elevation of his moral tone. "God be praised," said he, "there it is yonder! There is my pallet burning!" And comparing himself to the pilot who suffers shipwreck by night, "Salve," he added piously, "salve Maris Stella." Did he address this fragment of litany to the Holy Virgin, or to the pallet? We are utterly unable to say. He had taken but a few steps in the long street which sloped downwards, was unpaved, and more muddy and steep, when he noticed a very singular thing. It was not deserted. Here and there along its extent crawled certain vague and formless masses, all directing their course towards the light which flickered at the end of the street, like those heavy insects which drag along by night, from blade to blade of grass, towards the shepherd's fire. Nothing renders one so adventurous as not being able to feel the place where one's pocket is situated. Gringoire continued to advance, and had soon joined that one of the forms which dragged along most indolently behind the others. On drawing near, he perceived that it was nothing else than a wretched legless cripple in a bowl, who was hopping along on his two hands like a wounded field spider which has but two legs left. At the moment when he passed close to this species of spider with a human countenance, it raised towards him a lamentable voice. "La buona mansia, signor! La buona mansia!" "Deuce take you," said Gringoire, and me with you, if I know what you mean." And he passed on. He overtook another of these itinerant masses, and examined it. It was an impotent man, both halt and crippled to such a degree that the complicated system of crutches and wooden legs which sustained him gave him the air of a mason scaffolding on the march. Gringoire, who liked noble and classical comparisons, compared him in thought to the living tripod of Vulcan. This living tripod saluted him as he passed, but stopping his hat on a level with Gringoire's chin, like a shaving dish, while he shouted in the latter's ears, "Señor Caballero, para comprar un pedazo de pan." "It appears," said Gringoire, "that this one can also talk, but 'tis a rude language, and he is more fortunate than I if he understands it." Then, smiting his brow, in a sudden transition of ideas, "By the way, what the deuce did they mean this morning with their Esmeralda?" He was minded to augment his pace, but for the third time something barred his way. This something, or rather someone, was a blind man, a little blind fellow with a bearded, Jewish face, who, rowing away in the space about him with a stick, and towed by a large dog, droned through his nose with a Hungarian accent, "Facitote caritatem." "Well now," said Gringoire, "here's one at last who speaks a Christian tongue. I must have a very charitable aspect, since they ask alms of me in the present lean condition of my purse. My friend," and he turned towards the blind man, "I sold my last shirt last week. That is to say, since you understand only the language of Cicero, vendidi hebdomade nuper transita meam ultimam chemisan." That said, he turned his back upon the blind man, and pursued his way. But the blind man began to increase his stride at the same time, and behold, the cripple and the legless man, in his bowl, came up on their side in great haste, and with great clamour of bowl and crutches, upon the pavement. Then all three, jostling each other at poor Gringoire's heels, began to sing their song to him. "Caritatem," chanted the blind man. "La buona mansia," chanted the cripple in the bowl, and the lame man took up the musical phrase by repeating, "Un pedazo de pan." Gringoire stopped up his ears. "Oh, Tower of Babel!" he exclaimed. He set out to run. The blind man ran. The lame man ran. The cripple in the bowl ran. And then, in proportion as he plunged deeper into the street, cripples in bowls, blind men, and lame men swarmed about him, and men with one arm and with one eye, and the leprous with their sores, some emerging from little streets adjacent, some from the air-holes of cellars, howling, bellowing, yelping, all limping and halting, all flinging themselves towards the light, and humped up in the mire like snails after a shower. Gringoire, still followed by his three persecutors, and not knowing very well what was to become of him, marched along in terror among them, turning out for the lame, stepping over the cripples in bowls, with his feet embedded in that ant-hill of lame men, like the English captain who got caught in the quicksand of a swarm of crabs. The idea occurred to him of making every effort to retrace his steps, but it was too late. This whole legion had closed in behind him, and his three beggars held him fast. So he proceeded, impelled both by this irresistible flood, by fear, and by a vertigo which converted all this into a sort of horrible dream. At last he reached the end of the street. It opened upon an immense place, where 1,000 scattered lights flickered in the confused mists of night. Gringoire flew thither, hoping to escape, by the swiftness of his legs, from the three infirm spectres who had clutched him. "Onde vas, hombre?" "Where are you going, my man?" cried the cripple, flinging away his crutches, and running after him with the best legs that ever traced a geometrical step upon the pavements of Paris. In the meantime the legless man, erect upon his feet, crowned Gringoire with his heavy iron bowl, and the blind man glared in his face with flaming eyes. "Where am I?" said the terrified poet. "In the Court of Miracles," replied a fourth spectre, who had accosted them. "Upon my soul," resumed Gringoire, "I certainly do behold the blind who see, and the lame who walk, but where is the Saviour?" They replied by a burst of sinister laughter. The poor poet cast his eyes about him. It was, in truth, that redoubtable Cour de Miracles, whither an honest man had never penetrated at such an hour. The magic circle, where the officers of the Châtelet and the sergeants of the provostship who ventured thither disappeared in morsels. A city of thieves, a hideous wart on the face of Paris, a sewer from which escaped every morning and whither returned every night to crouch that stream of vices, of mendicancy and vagabondage which always overflows in the streets of capitals. A monstrous hive, to which returned at nightfall with their booty all the drones of the social order. A lying hospital, where the bohemian, the disfrocked monk, the ruined scholar, the ne'er-do-wells of all nations, Spaniards, Italians, Germans, of all religions, Jews, Christians, Mahometans, idolaters, covered with painted sores, beggars by day, were transformed by night into brigands. An immense dressing-room, in a word, where, at that epoch, the actors of that eternal comedy which theft, prostitution, and murder play upon the pavements of Paris, dressed and undressed. It was a vast place, irregular and badly paved, like all the squares of Paris at that date. Fires, around which swarmed strange groups, blazed here and there. Everyone was going, coming, and shouting. Shrill laughter was to be heard, the wailing of children, the voices of women. The hands and heads of this throng, black against the luminous background, outlined against it 1,000 eccentric gestures. At times, upon the ground, where trembled the light of the fires, mingled with large, indefinite shadows, one could behold a dog passing, which resembled a man who resembled a dog. The limits of races and species seemed effaced in this city as in a pandemonium. Men, women, beasts, age, sex, health, maladies, all seemed to be in common among these people. All went together. They mingled, confounded, superposed. Each one there participated in all. The poor and flickering flames of the fire permitted Gringoire to distinguish, amid his trouble, all around the immense place, a hideous frame of ancient houses, whose worm-eaten, shriveled, stunted facades, each pierced with one or two lighted attic windows, seemed to him, in the darkness, like enormous heads of old women, ranged in a circle, monstrous and crabbed, winking as they looked on the witches' Sabbath. It was like a new world, unknown, unheard of, misshapen, creeping, swarming, fantastic. Gringoire, more and more terrified, clutched by the three beggars as by three pairs of tongs, dazed by a throng of other faces which frothed and yelped around him, unhappy Gringoire endeavored to summon his presence of mind in order to recall whether it was a Saturday. But his efforts were in vain. The thread of his memory and of his thought was broken, and, doubting everything, wavering between what he saw and what he felt, he put to himself this unanswerable question: "If I exist, does this exist? If this exists, do I exist?" At that moment a distinct cry arose in the buzzing throng which surrounded him. "Let's take him to the king! Let's take him to the king!" "Holy Virgin!" murmured Gringoire. "The king here must be a ram!" "To the king! To the king!" repeated all the voices. They dragged him off. Each vied with the other in laying his claws upon him. But the three beggars did not loose their hold, and tore him from the rest, howling, "He belongs to us!" The poet's already sickly doublet yielded its last sigh in this struggle. While traversing the horrible place, his vertigo vanished. After taking a few steps, the sentiment of reality returned to him. He began to become accustomed to the atmosphere of the place. At the first moment there had arisen from his poet's head, or simply and prosaically from his empty stomach, a mist, a vapor so to speak, which, spreading between objects and himself, permitted him to catch a glimpse of them only in the incoherent fog of nightmare, in those shadows of dreams which distort every outline, agglomerating objects into unwieldy groups, dilating things into chimeras, and men into phantoms. Little by little, this hallucination was succeeded by a less bewildered and exaggerating view. Reality made its way to the light around him, struck his eyes, struck his feet, and demolished, bit by bit, all that frightful poetry with which he had at first believed himself to be surrounded. He was forced to perceive that he was not walking in the Styx, but in mud, that he was elbowed not by demons, but by thieves, that it was not his soul which was in question, but his life, since he lacked that precious conciliator which places itself so effectually between the bandit and the honest man, a purse. In short, on examining the orgy more closely, and with more coolness, he fell from the witch's Sabbath to the dram-shop. The Cour de Miracles was in fact merely a dram-shop, but a brigand's dram-shop, reddened quite as much with blood as with wine. The spectacle which presented itself to his eyes, when his ragged escort finally deposited him at the end of his trip, was not fitted to bear him back to poetry, even to the poetry of hell. It was more than ever the prosaic and brutal reality of the tavern. Were we not in the 15th century, we would say that Gringoire had descended from Michelangelo to Callot. Around a great fire, which burned on a large, circular flagstone, the flames of which had heated red-hot the legs of a tripod, which was empty for the moment, some worm-eaten tables were placed here and there, haphazard, no lackey of a geometrical turn having deigned to adjust their parallelism, or to see to it that they did not make too unusual angles. Upon these tables gleamed several dripping pots of wine and beer, and around these pots were grouped many Bacchic visages, purple with the fire and the wine. There was a man with a huge belly and a jovial face, noisily kissing a woman of the town, thick-set and brawny. There was a sort of sham soldier, a Naqua, as the slang expression runs, who was whistling as he undid the bandages from his fictitious wound, and removing the numbness from his sound and vigorous knee, which had been swathed since morning in 1,000 ligatures. On the other hand, there was a wretched fellow, preparing with celandine and beef's blood his leg of God for the next day. 2 tables further on, a palmer, with his pilgrim's costume complete, was practicing the lament of the Holy Queen, not forgetting the drone and the nasal drawl. Further on, a young scamp was taking a lesson in epilepsy from an old pretender, who was instructing him in the art of foaming at the mouth by chewing a morsel of soap. Beside him, a man with the dropsy was getting rid of his swelling, and making 4 or 5 female thieves, who were disputing at the same table over a child who had been stolen that evening, hold their noses. All circumstances which, 2 centuries later, seemed so ridiculous to the court, as Sauval says, that they served as a pastime to the king, and as an introduction to the royal ballet of Night, divided into 4 parts and danced on the theatre of the Petit Bourbon. Never, adds an eye-witness of 1653, have the sudden metamorphoses of the Court of Miracles been more happily presented. Benserade prepared us for it by some very gallant verses. Loud laughter everywhere, and obscene songs. Each one held his own course, carping and swearing without listening to his neighbor. Pots clinked, and quarrels sprang up at the shock of the pots, and the broken pots made rents in the rags. A big dog, seated on his tail, gazed at the fire. Some children were mingled in this orgy. The stolen child wept and cried, another, a big boy 4 years of age, seated with legs dangling upon a bench that was too high for him, before a table that reached to his chin, was uttering not a word. A third, gravely spreading out upon the table with his finger the melted tallow which dripped from a candle. Last of all, a little fellow crouching in the mud, almost lost in a cauldron which he was scraping with a tile, and from which he was evoking a sound that would have made Stradivarius swoon. Near the fire was a hogshead, and on the hogshead a beggar. This was the king on his throne. The three who had Gringoire in their clutches led him in front of this hogshead, and the entire Bacchanal rout fell silent for a moment, with the exception of the cauldron inhabited by the child. Gringoire dared neither breathe nor raise his eyes. "Hombre, quita tu sombrero," said one of the three knaves, in whose grasp he was, and before he had comprehended the meaning the other had snatched his hat, a wretched headgear, it is true, but still good on a sunny day, or when there was but little rain. Gringoire sighed. Meanwhile the king addressed him, from the summit of his cask. "Who is this rogue?" Gringoire shuddered. That voice, although accentuated by menace, recalled to him another voice, which, that very morning, had dealt the death-blow to his mystery, by drawling nasally in the midst of the audience, "Charity, please!" He raised his head. It was indeed Clopin Truffaut. Clopin Truffaut, arrayed in his royal insignia, wore neither one rag more nor one rag less. The sore upon his arm had already disappeared. He held in his hand one of those whips made of thongs of white leather, which police sergeants then used to repress the crowd, and which were called boyets. On his head he wore a sort of headgear, bound round and closed at the top. But it was difficult to make out whether it was a child's cap or a king's crown, the two things bore so strong a resemblance to each other. Meanwhile Gringoire, without knowing why, had regained some hope, on recognizing in the king of the Cour des Miracles his accursed mendicant of the Grand Hall. "Master," stammered he, "Monseigneur, Sire, how ought I to address you?" he said at length, having reached the culminating point of his crescendo, and knowing neither how to mount higher nor to descend again. "Monseigneur, His Majesty, or comrade, call me what you please, but make haste. What have you to say in your own defense?" "In your own defense?" thought Gringoire. "That displeases me." He resumed, stuttering, "I am he who, this morning—" "By the devil's claws!" interrupted Clopin. "Your name, knave, and nothing more. Listen, you are in the presence of three powerful sovereigns. Myself, Clopin Truffaut, King of Tournai, successor to the Grand Coessé, supreme suzerain of the realm of Argo. Matthias Hunyadi Spicali, Duke of Egypt and of Bohemia, the old yellow fellow whom you see yonder, with a dish-clout round his head. Guillaume Ressault, Emperor of Galilee, that fat fellow who is not listening to us but caressing a wench. We are your judges. You have entered the kingdom of Argo without being an Argotier. You have violated the privileges of our city. You must be punished unless you're a capon, a franc, miteau, or a rifaudet, that is to say, in the slang of honest folks, a thief, a beggar, or a vagabond. Are you anything of that sort? Justify yourself. Announce your titles." "Alas," said Gringoire, "I have not that honor." "I am the author—" "That is sufficient," resumed Truffaut, without permitting him to finish. "You are going to be hanged. 'Tis a very simple matter, gentlemen and honest bourgeois. As you treat our people in your abode, so we treat you in ours. The law which you apply to vagabonds, vagabonds apply to you. 'Tis your fault if it is harsh. One really must behold the grimace of an honest man above the hempen collar now and then. That renders the thing honorable. Come, friend, divide your rags gaily among these damsels. I am going to have you hanged to amuse the vagabonds, and you are to give them your purse to drink your health. If you have any mummery to go through with, there's a very good God the Father in that mortar yonder in stone, which we stole from the Saint Pierre aux Boeufs. You have 4 minutes in which to fling your soul at his head." The harangue was formidable. "Well said, upon my soul! Clopin Trifot preaches like the Holy Father the Pope," exclaimed the Emperor of Galilee, smashing his pot in order to prop up his table. "Monseigneurs, emperors, and kings," said Gringoire coolly, for I know not how, firmness had returned to him, and he spoke with resolution. "Don't think of such a thing. My name is Pierre Gringoire. I am the poet whose morality was presented this morning in the grand hall of the courts." "Ah, so it was you, master," said Clopin. "I was there, Zete Deu. Well, comrade, is that any reason, because you bored us to death this morning, that you should not be hung this evening?" "I shall find difficulty in getting out of it," said Gringoire to himself. Nevertheless, he made one more effort. "I don't see why poets are not classed with vagabonds," said he. "Vagabond. Aesopus certainly was. Homerus was a beggar. Mercurius was a thief." Clopin interrupted him. "I believe that you are trying to blarney us with your jargon. Zounds! Let yourself be hung, and don't kick up such a row over it." "Pardon me, Monseigneur the King of Tournay," replied Gringoire, disputing the ground foot by foot. "It is worth trouble. One moment, listen to me. You are not going to condemn me without having heard me." His unlucky voice was, in fact, drowned in the uproar which rose around him. The little boy scraped away at his cauldron with more spirit than ever, and, to crown all, an old woman had just placed on the tripod a frying-pan of grease, which hissed away on the fire with a noise similar to the cry of a troop of children in pursuit of a masker. In the meantime, Clopin Trifot appeared to hold a momentary conference with the Duke of Egypt and the Emperor of Galilee, who was completely drunk. Then he shouted shrilly, "Silence!" and as the cauldron and the frying-pan did not heed him, and continued their duet, he jumped down from his hogshead and gave a kick to the boiler, which rolled 10 paces away bearing the child with it, a kick to the frying-pan, which upset in the fire with all its grease, and gravely remounted his throne, without troubling himself about the stifled tears of the child or the grumbling of the old woman, whose supper was wasting away in a fine white flame. Trifot made a sign, and the Duke, the Emperor, and the past masters of pickpockets and the isolated robbers came and ranged themselves around him in a horseshoe, of which Gringoire, still roughly held by the body, formed the center. It was a semicircle of rags, tatters, tinsel, pitchforks, axes, legs staggering with intoxication, huge, bare arms, faces sordid, dull, and stupid. In the midst of this round table of beggary, Clopin Trifot, as the Doge of this Senate, as the King of this peerage, as the Pope of this conclave, dominated. First, by virtue of the height of his hogshead, and next by virtue of an indescribable haughty, fierce, and formidable air, which caused his eyes to flash and corrected in his savage profile the bestial type of the race of vagabonds. One would have pronounced him a boar amid a herd of swine. "Listen," said he to Gringoire, fondling his misshapen chin with his horny hand. "I don't see why you should not be hung. It is true that it appears to be repugnant to you, and it is very natural, for you bourgeois are not accustomed to it. You form for yourselves a great idea of the thing. After all, we don't wish you any harm. Here is a means of extricating yourself from your predicament for the moment. Will you become one of us?" The reader can judge of the effect which this proposition produced upon Gringoire, who beheld life slipping away from him, and who was beginning to lose his hold upon it. He clutched it again with energy. "Certainly I will, and right heartily," said he. "Do you consent," resumed Clopin, "to enroll yourself among the people of the knife?" "Of the knife, precisely," responded Gringoire. "You recognize yourself as a member of the free bourgeoisie?" added the King of Tournay. "Of the free bourgeoisie." "Subject of the kingdom of Argo?" "Of the kingdom of Argo." "A vagabond?" "A vagabond." "In your soul?" "In my soul." "I must call your attention to the fact," continued the king, "that you will be hung all the same." "The devil!" said the poet. "Only," continued Clopin imperturbably, "you will be hung later on, with more ceremony, at the expense of the good city of Paris, on a handsome stone gibbet and by honest men. That is a consolation." "Just so," responded Gringoire. "There are other advantages. In your quality of a high-toned sharper, you will not have to pay the taxes on mud, or the poor, or lanterns to which the bourgeois of Paris are subject." "So be it," said the poet. "I agree. I am a vagabond, a thief, a sharper, a man of the knife, anything you please. And I am all that already, Monsieur King of Tournay, for I am a philosopher. Et omnia in philosophia, omnis in philosopho continentur. All things are contained in philosophy, all men in the philosopher, as you know." The King of Tournay scowled. "What do you take me for, my friend? What Hungarian Jew patter are you jabbering at us? I don't know Hebrew. One isn't a Jew because one is a bandit. I don't even steal any longer. I'm above all that. I kill. Cutthroat, yes. Cut-purse, no." Gringoire tried to slip in some excuse between these curt words, which wrath rendered more and more jerky. "I ask your pardon, Monseigneur. It is not Hebrew, 'tis Latin." "I tell you," resumed Clopin angrily, "that I am not a Jew, and that I'll have you hung, belly of the synagogue, like that little shopkeeper of Judea, who is by your side, and whom I entertain strong hopes of seeing nailed to a counter one of these days, like the counterfeit coin that he is." So saying, he pointed his finger at the little bearded Hungarian Jew who had accosted Gringoire with his facitote caritatum, and who, understanding no other language, beheld with surprise the King of Tournay's ill-humour overflow upon him. At length Monsieur Clopin calmed down. "So you will be a vagabond, you knave?" he said to our poet. "Of course," replied the poet. "Willing is not all," said the surly Clopin. "Good will doesn't put one onion the more into the soup, and is good for nothing except to go to Paradise with. Now, Paradise and the thieves' band are two different things. In order to be received among the thieves, you must prove that you are good for something, and for that purpose you must search the mannequin." "I'll search anything you like," said Gringoire. Clopin made a sign. Several thieves detached themselves from the circle and returned a moment later. They brought 2 thick posts, terminated at their lower extremities in spreading timber supports, which made them stand readily upon the ground. To the upper extremity of the 2 posts they fitted a cross-beam, and the whole constituted a very pretty portable gibbet, which Gringoire had the satisfaction of beholding rise before him in a twinkling. Nothing was lacking, not even the rope, which swung gracefully over the cross-beam. "What are they going to do?" Gringoire asked himself with some uneasiness. A sound of bells, which he heard at that moment, put an end to his anxiety. It was a stuffed mannequin, which the vagabonds were suspending by the neck from the rope, a sort of scarecrow dressed in red, and so hung with mule bells and larger bells that one might have tricked out 30 Castilian mules with them. These 1,000 tiny bells quivered for some time with the vibration of the rope, then gradually died away, and finally became silent when the mannikin had been brought into a state of immobility by that law of the pendulum which has dethroned the water clock and the hourglass. Then Clopin, pointing out to Gringoire a rickety old stool placed beneath the mannikin, "Climb up there." "Death of the devil!" objected Gringoire. "I shall break my neck. Your stool limps like one of Marshall's distichs. It has one hexameter leg and one pentameter leg." "Climb!" repeated Clopin. Gringoire mounted the stool, and succeeded, not without some oscillations of head and arms, in regaining his center of gravity. "Now," went on the King of Tournay, "twist your right foot round your left leg, and rise on the tip of your left foot." "Monseigneur," said Gringoire, "so you absolutely insist on my breaking some of my limbs?" Clopin tossed his head. "Hark ye, my friend, you talk too much. Here's the gist of the matter in 2 words. You are to rise on tiptoe as I tell you. In that way you will be able to reach the pocket of the mannikin. You will rummage it, you will pull out the purse that is there. And if you do all this without our hearing the sound of a bell, all is well. You shall be a vagabond. All we shall then have to do will be to thrash you soundly for the space of a week." "Ventre Dieu! I will be careful," said Gringoire. "And suppose I do make the bell sound? Then you will be hanged. Do you understand?" "I don't understand at all," replied Gringoire. "Listen once more. You are to search the mannikin, and take away its purse. If a single bell stirs during the operation, you will be hung. Do you understand that?" "Good," said Gringoire. "I understand that. And then?" "If you succeed in removing the purse without our hearing the bells, you are a vagabond, and you will be thrashed for 8 consecutive days. You understand now, no doubt?" "No, monsieur, I no longer understand. Where is the advantage to me? Hanged in one case, cudgelled in the other." "And a vagabond," resumed Clopin. "And a vagabond. Is that nothing? It is for your interest that we should beat you, in order to harden you to blows." "Many thanks," replied the poet. "Come, make haste," said the king, stamping upon his casque, which resounded like a huge drum. "Search the mannikin, and let there be an end to this. I warn you for the last time that if I hear a single bell, you will take the place of the mannikin." The band of thieves applauded Clopin's words, and arranged themselves in a circle round the gibbet, with a laugh so pitiless that Gringoire perceived that he amused them too much not to have everything to fear from them. No hope was left for him, accordingly, unless it were the slight chance of succeeding in the formidable operation which was imposed upon him. He decided to risk it, but it was not without first having addressed a fervent prayer to the mannikin he was about to plunder, and who would have been easier to move to pity than the vagabonds. These myriad bells, with their little copper tongues, seemed to him like the mouths of so many asps, open and ready to sting and to hiss. "Oh," he said in a very low voice, "is it possible that my life depends on the slightest vibration of the least of these bells? Oh," he added with clasped hands, "bells do not ring, handbells do not clang, mule bells do not quiver." He made one more attempt upon Tréfoe. "And if there should come a gust of wind?" "You will be hanged," replied the other, without hesitation. Perceiving that no respite, nor reprieve, nor subterfuge was possible, he bravely decided upon his course of action. He wound his right foot round his left leg, raised himself on his left foot, and stretched out his arm. But at the moment when his hand touched the mannikin, his body, which was now supported upon one leg only, wavered on the stool, which had but 3. He made an involuntary effort to support himself by the mannikin, lost his balance, and fell heavily to the ground, deafened by the fatal vibration of the 1,000 bells of the mannikin, which, yielding to the impulse imparted by his hand, described first a rotary motion, and then swayed majestically between the two posts. "Malediction!" he cried as he fell, and remained as though dead, with his face to the earth. Meanwhile he heard the dreadful peal above his head, the diabolical laughter of the vagabonds, and the voice of Trophi saying, "Pick me up that knave, and hang him without ceremony." He rose. They had already detached the mannikin to make room for him. The thieves made him mount the stool. Clopin came to him, passed the rope about his neck, and tapping him on the shoulder, "Adieu, my friend. You can't escape now, even if you digested with the Pope's guts." The word "mercy" died away upon Gringoire's lips. He cast his eyes about him, but there was no hope. All were laughing. "Bellevine de la Toise," said the King of Tournay to an enormous vagabond who stepped out from the ranks. "Climb upon the cross-beam." Bellevine de la Toise nimbly mounted the traverse beam, and in another minute Gringoire, on raising his eyes, beheld him, with terror, seated upon the beam above his head. "Now," resumed Clopin Truffaut, "as soon as I clap my hands, you, Andre the Red, will fling the stool to the ground with a blow of your knee. You, Francois Chanteprune, will cling to the feet of the rascal, and you, Bellevine, will fling yourself on his shoulders, and all three at once, do you hear?" Gringoire shuddered. "Are you ready?" said Clopin Truffaut to the three thieves, who held themselves in readiness to fall upon Gringoire. A moment of horrible suspense ensued for the poor victim, during which Clopin tranquilly thrust into the fire with the tip of his foot some bits of vine-shoots which the flame had not caught. "Are you ready?" he repeated, and opened his hands to clap. 1 second more, and all would have been over. But he paused, as though struck by a sudden thought. "One moment," said he. "I forgot. It is our custom not to hang a man without inquiring whether there is any woman who wants him. Comrade, this is your last resource. You must wed either a female vagabond or the noose." This law of the vagabonds, singular as it may strike the reader, remains today written out at length in ancient English legislation. Gringoire breathed again. This was the second time that he had returned to life within an hour, so he did not dare to trust to it too implicitly. "Hola!" cried Clopin, mounted once more upon his cask. "Hola, women, females! Is there among you, from the sorceress to her cat, a wench who wants this rascal? Hola, Colette la Charonne, Elizabeth Trouvin, Simone Jourdain, Marie Pedebot, Tonnet Lalonde, Bérard Fanouille, Michel Janaille, Claude Rongeoret, Mathurine Girardeau. Hola, Isabeau Lathieri, come and see, a man for nothing. Who wants him?" Gringoire, no doubt, was not very appetizing in his miserable condition. The female vagabonds did not seem to be much affected by the proposition. The unhappy wretch heard them answer, "No, no, hang him! There'll be more fun for us all!" Nevertheless, 3 emerged from the throng and came to smell of him. The first was a big wench with a square face. She examined the philosopher's deplorable doublet attentively. His garment was worn, and more full of holes than a stove for roasting chestnuts. The girl made a wry face. "Old rag," she muttered, and addressing Gringoire, "Let's see your cloak." "I have lost it," replied Gringoire. "Your hat?" "They took it away from me." "Your shoes?" "They have hardly any soles left." "Your purse?" "Alas," stammered Gringoire, "I have not even a sou." "Let them hang you, then, and say thank you," retorted the vagabond wench, turning her back on him. The second, old, black, wrinkled, hideous, with an ugliness conspicuous even in the Cour des Miracles, trotted round Gringoire. He almost trembled lest she should want him. But she mumbled between her teeth, he's too thin," and went off. The third was a young girl, quite fresh, and not too ugly. "Save me," said the poor fellow to her in a low tone. She gazed at him for a moment with an air of pity, then dropped her eyes, made a plait in her petticoat, and remained in indecision. He followed all these movements with his eyes. It was the last gleam of hope. "No," said the young girl at length. "No, Guillaume Langlois would beat me." She retreated into the crowd. "You are unlucky, comrade," said Clopin. Then, rising to his feet upon his hogshead, "No one wants him!" he exclaimed, imitating the accent of an auctioneer, to the great delight of all. "No one wants him? Once, twice, 3 times!" And, turning towards the gibbet with a sign of his hand, "Gone!" Bellavine de l'Etoile, André the Red, Francois Chanteprunet stepped up to Gringoire. At that moment a cry arose among the thieves. "La Esmeralda! La Esmeralda!" Gringoire shuddered, and turned towards the side whence the clamour proceeded. The crowd opened and gave passage to a pure and dazzling form. It was the gypsy. "La Esmeralda!" said Gringoire, stupefied in the midst of his emotions by the abrupt manner in which that magic word knotted together all his reminiscences of the day. This rare creature seemed, even in the Cour des Miracles, to exercise her sway of charm and beauty. The vagabonds, male and female, ranged themselves gently along her path, and their brutal faces beamed beneath her glance. She approached the victim with her light step. Her pretty Jolly followed her. Gringoire was more dead than alive. She examined him for a moment in silence. "You are going to hang this man?" she said gravely to Clopin. "Yes, sister," replied the King of Tournay, "unless you will take him for your husband." She made her pretty little pout with her under lip. "I'll take him," said she. Gringoire firmly believed that he had been in a dream ever since morning, and that this was the continuation of it. The change was, in fact, violent, though a gratifying one. They undid the noose and made the poet step down from the stool. His emotion was so lively that he was obliged to sit down. The Duke of Egypt brought an earthenware crock without uttering a word. The gypsy offered it to Gringoire. "Fling it on the ground," said she. The crock broke into 4 pieces. "Brother," then said the Duke of Egypt, laying his hands upon their foreheads, "she is your wife. Sister, he is your husband for 4 years. Go." End of chapter 6. Book 2, Chapter 7 of The Hunchback of Notre Dame, by Victor Hugo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 7 A Bridal Night. A few moments later our poet found himself in a tiny arched chamber. Very cozy, very warm, seated at a table which appeared to ask nothing better than to make some loans from a larder hanging nearby, having a good bed in prospect, and alone with a pretty girl. The adventure smacked of enchantment. He began seriously to take himself for a personage in a fairy tale. He cast his eyes about him from time to time, as though to see if the chariot of fire, harnessed to 2 winged chimeras, which alone could have so rapidly transported him from Tartarus to Paradise, were still there. At times, also, he fixed his eyes obstinately upon the holes in his doublet, in order to cling to reality, and not lose the ground from under his feet completely. His reason, tossed about in imaginary space, now hung only by this thread. The young girl did not appear to pay any attention to him. She went and came, displaced a stool, talked to her goat, and indulged in a pout now and then. At last she came and seated herself near the table, and Gringoire was able to scrutinize her at his ease. You have been a child, reader, and you would perhaps be very happy to be one still. It is quite certain that you have not more than once, and for my part I have passed whole days, the best employed of my life at it, followed from thicket to thicket, by the side of running water, on a sunny day, a beautiful green or blue dragonfly breaking its flight in abrupt angles, and kissing the tips of all the branches. You recollect with what amorous curiosity your thought and your gaze were riveted upon this little whirlwind, hissing and humming with wings of purple and azure, in the midst of which floated an imperceptible body, veiled by the very rapidity of its movement. The aerial being which was dimly outlined amid this quivering of wings appeared to you chimerical, imaginary, impossible to touch, impossible to see. But then, at length, the dragonfly alighted on the tip of a reed, and, holding your breath the while, you were able to examine the long gauze wings, the long enamel robe, the two globes of crystal. What astonishment you felt, and what fear lest you should again behold the form disappear into a shade, and the creature into a chimera. Recall these impressions, and you will readily appreciate what Gringoire felt on contemplating, beneath her visible and palpable form, that Esmeralda of whom, up to that time, he had only caught a glimpse amidst a whirlwind of dance, song, and tumult. Sinking deeper and deeper into his reverie, "So this," he said to himself, following her vaguely with his eyes, "is La Esmeralda. A celestial creature, a street dancer, so much and so little. 'Twas she who dealt the death-blow to my mystery this morning. 'Tis she who saves my life this evening. My evil genius, my good angel. A pretty woman, on my word, and who must needs love me madly to have taken me in that fashion. By the way," said he, rising suddenly, with that sentiment of the true which formed the foundation of his character and his philosophy, "I don't know very well how it happens, but I am her husband." With this idea in his head and in his eyes, he stepped up to the young girl in a manner so military and so gallant that she drew back. "What do you want of me?" said she. "Can you ask me, adorable Esmeralda?" replied Gringoire, with so passionate an accent that he was himself astonished at it on hearing himself speak. The gypsy opened her great eyes. "I don't know what you mean." "What?" resumed Gringoire, growing warmer and warmer, and supposing that, after all, he had to deal merely with a virtue of the Cour des Miracles. "Am I not thine, sweet friend? Art thou not mine?" And, quite ingenuously, he clasped her waist. The gypsy's corsage slipped through his hands like the skin of an eel. She bounded from one end of the tiny room to the other, stooped down, and raised herself again, with a little poniard in her hand, before Gringoire had even had time to see whence the poniard came, proud and angry, with swelling lips and inflated nostrils, her cheeks as red as an Appy apple, and her eyes darting lightnings. At the same time the white goat placed itself in front of her, and presented to Gringoire a hostile front, bristling with two pretty horns, gilded and very sharp. All this took place in the twinkling of an eye. The dragonfly had turned into a wasp, and asked nothing better than to sting. Our philosopher was speechless, and turned his astonished eyes from the goat to the young girl. "Holy Virgin!" he said at last, when surprise permitted him to speak, "here are two hearty dames." The gypsy broke the silence on her side. "You must be a very bold knave." "Pardon, mademoiselle," said Gringoire with a smile, "but why did you take me for your husband?" "Should I have allowed you to be hanged?" "So," said the poet, somewhat disappointed in his amorous hopes, "you had no other idea in marrying me than to save me from the gibbet?" "And what other idea did you suppose that I had?" Gringoire bit his lips. "Come," said he, "I am not yet so triumphant in Cupido as I thought. But then, What was the good of breaking that poor jug? Meanwhile, Esmeralda's dagger and the goat's horns were still upon the defensive. "Mademoiselle Esmeralda," said the poet, "let us come to terms. I am not a clerk of the court, and I shall not go to law with you for thus carrying a dagger in Paris, in the teeth of the ordinances and the prohibitions of Monsieur the Provost. Nevertheless, you are not ignorant of the fact that Noel L'Escrivain was condemned a week ago to pay 10 Parisian sous for having carried a cutlass. But this is no affair of mine, and I will come to the point. I swear to you, upon my share of paradise, not to approach you without your leave and permission, but do give me some supper." The truth is, Gringoire was, like Monsieur Despreaux, not very voluptuous. He did not belong to that chevalier and musketeer species who take young girls by assault. In the matter of love, as in all other affairs, he willingly assented to temporizing and adjusting terms. And a good supper and an amiable tete-a-tete appeared to him, especially when he was hungry, an excellent interlude between the prologue and the catastrophe of a love adventure. The gypsy did not reply. She made her disdainful little grimace, drew up her head like a bird, then burst out laughing, and the tiny poniard disappeared as it had come, without Gringoire being able to see where the wasp concealed its sting. A moment later there stood upon the table a loaf of rye bread, a slice of bacon, some wrinkled apples, and a jug of beer. Gringoire began to eat eagerly. One would have said, to hear the furious clashing of his iron fork and his earthenware plate, that all his love had turned to appetite. The young girl seated opposite him watched him in silence, visibly preoccupied with another thought, at which she smiled from time to time, while her soft hand caressed the intelligent head of the goat, gently pressed between her knees. A candle of yellow wax illuminated this scene of voracity and reverie. Meanwhile, the first cravings of his stomach having been stilled, Gringoire felt some false shame at perceiving that nothing remained but one apple. "You do not eat, Mademoiselle Esmeralda?" She replied by a negative sign of the head, and her pensive glance fixed itself upon the vault of the ceiling. "What the deuce is she thinking of?" thought Gringoire, staring at what she was gazing at. "'Tis impossible that it can be that stone dwarf carved in the keystone of that arch, which thus absorbs her attention. What the deuce! I can bear the comparison." He raised his voice. "Mademoiselle—" She seemed not to hear him. He repeated, still more loudly, "Mademoiselle Esmeralda!" Trouble wasted. The young girl's mind was elsewhere, and Gringoire's voice had not the power to recall it. Fortunately, the goat interfered. She began to pull her mistress gently by the sleeve. "What dost thou want, Jolly?" said the gypsy hastily, as though suddenly awakened. "She is hungry," said Gringoire, charmed to enter into conversation. Esmeralda began to crumble some bread, which Jolly ate gracefully from the hollow of her hand. Moreover, Gringoire did not give her time to resume her reverie. He hazarded a delicate question. "So you don't want me for your husband?" The young girl looked at him intently, and said, "No." "For your lover?" went on Gringoire. She pouted, and replied, "No." "For your friend?" pursued Gringoire. She gazed fixedly at him again, and said, after a momentary reflection, "Perhaps." This "perhaps," so dear to philosophers, emboldened Gringoire. "Do you know what friendship is?" he asked. "Yes," replied the gypsy. "It is to be brother and sister, two souls which touch without mingling, two fingers on one hand." "And love?" pursued Gringoire. "Oh, love," said she, and her voice trembled, and her eye beamed. "That is to be two and to be but one, a man and a woman mingled into one angel. It is heaven." The street dancer had a beauty as she spoke thus that struck Gringoire singularly, and seemed to him in perfect keeping with the almost oriental exaltation of her words. Her pure red lips half smiled, her serene and candid brow became troubled at intervals under her thoughts like a mirror under the breath, and from beneath her long, drooping black eyelashes there escaped a sort of ineffable light, which gave to her profile that ideal serenity which Raphael found at the mystic point of intersection of virginity, maternity, and divinity. Nevertheless, Gringoire continued, "What must one be, then, in order to please you?" "A man." "And I," said he, "what then am I?" "A man has a helmet on his head, a sword in his hand, and golden spurs on his heels." "Good," said Gringoire. "Without a horse, no man. Do you love anyone?" "As a lover?" "Yes." She remained thoughtful for a moment, then said with a peculiar expression, "That I shall know soon." "Why not this evening?" resumed the poet tenderly. "Why not me?" She cast a grave glance upon him, and said, "I can never love a man who cannot protect me." Gringoire coloured, and took the hint. It was evident that the young girl was alluding to the slight assistance which he had rendered her in the critical situation in which she had found herself 2 hours previously. This memory, effaced by his own adventures of the evening, now recurred to him. He smote his brow. "By the way, mademoiselle, I ought to have begun there. Pardon my foolish absence of mind. How did you contrive to escape from the claws of Quasimodo?" This question made the gypsy shudder. "Oh, the horrible hunchback!" said she, hiding her face in her hands, and she shuddered as though with a violent cold. "Horrible, in truth," said Gringoire, who clung to his idea. "But how did you manage to escape him?" La Esmeralda smiled, sighed, and remained silent. "Do you know why he followed you?" began Gringoire again, seeking to return to his question by a circuitous route. "I don't know," said the young girl, and she added hastily, "But you were following me also. Why were you following me?" "In good faith," responded Gringoire, "I don't know either." Silence ensued. Gringoire slashed the table with his knife. The young girl smiled, and seemed to be gazing through the wall at something. All at once she began to sing in a barely articulate voice, "Cuando las pintadas aves mudas están y la tierra." She broke off abruptly and began to caress Jolly. "That's a pretty animal of yours," said Gringoire. "She is my sister," she answered. "Why are you called La Esmeralda?" asked the poet. "I do not know." "But why?" She drew from her bosom a sort of little oblong bag, suspended from her neck by a string of Adrezerac beads. This bag exhaled a strong odor of camphor. It was covered with green silk, and bore in its center a large piece of green glass, an imitation of an emerald. "Perhaps it is because of this," said she. Gringoire was on the point of taking the bag in his hand. She drew back. "Don't touch it! It is an amulet. You would injure the charm, or the charm would injure you." The poet's curiosity was more and more aroused. "Who gave it to you?" She laid one finger on her mouth and concealed the amulet in her bosom. He tried a few more questions, but she hardly replied. "What is the meaning of the words La Esmeralda?" "I don't know," said she. "To what language do they belong?" "They are Egyptian, I think." "I suspected as much," said Gringoire. "You are not a native of France?" "I don't know." "Are your parents alive?" She began to sing, to an ancient air, "Mon père est oiseau, ma mère est oisée. Je passe l'eau sans nacelle, je passe l'eau sans bateau. Ma mère est oisée, mon père est oiseau." "Good," said Gringoire. At what age did you come to France?" "When I was very young." "And when to Paris?" "Last year. At the moment when we were entering the Papal Gate, I saw a reed warbler flit through the air. That was at the end of August. I said, 'It will be a hard winter.'" "And so it was," said Gringoire, delighted at this beginning of a conversation. "I passed it in blowing my fingers. So you have the gift of prophecy?" She retired into her laconics again. "Is that man whom you call the Duke of Egypt the chief of your tribe?" "Yes." "But it was he who married us," remarked the poet timidly. She made her customary pretty grimace. "I don't even know your name." "My name? If you want it, here it is. Pierre Gringoire." "I know a prettier one," said she. "Naughty girl," retorted the poet. "Never mind, you shall not provoke me. Wait, perhaps you will love me more when you know me better, and then you have told me your story with so much confidence that I owe you a little of mine. You must know, then, that my name is Pierre Gringoire, and that I am the son of the farmer of the notary's office of Gonesse. My father was hung by the Burgundians, and my mother disemboweled by the Picards at the siege of Paris 20 years ago. At 6 years of age, therefore, I was an orphan, without a sole to my foot except the pavements of Paris. I do not know how I passed the interval from 6 to 16. A fruit dealer gave me a plum here, a baker flung me a crust there. In the evening I got myself taken up by the watch, who threw me into prison, and there I found a bundle of straw. All this did not prevent my growing up and growing thin, as you see. In the winter I warmed myself in the sun, under the porch of the Hôtel des Saints, and thought it very ridiculous that the fire on St. John's Day was reserved for the dog days. At 16 I wished to choose a calling. I tried all in succession. I became a soldier, but I was not brave enough. I became a monk, but I was not sufficiently devout. And then I'm a bad hand at drinking. In despair, I became an apprentice of the woodcutters, but I was not strong enough. I had more of an inclination to become a schoolmaster. 'Tis true that I did not know how to read, but that's no reason. I perceived at the end of a certain time that I lacked something in every direction, and seeing that I was good for nothing, of my own free will I became a poet and a rhymester. That is a trade which one can always adopt when one is a vagabond, and it's better than stealing, as some young brigands of my acquaintance advised me to do. One day I met by luck Dom Claude Frollo, the Reverend Archdeacon of Notre Dame. He took an interest in me, and it is to him that I today owe it that I am a veritable man of letters, who knows Latin from the De Officiis of Cicero to the Mortuology of the Celestine Fathers, and a barbarian neither in scholastics, nor in politics, nor in rhythmics, that sophism of sophisms. I am the author of the mystery which was presented today with great triumph and a great concourse of populace in the grand hall of the Palais de Justice. I have also made a book which will contain 600 pages, on the wonderful comet of 1465, which sent one man mad. I have enjoyed still other successes. Being somewhat of an artillery carpenter, I lent a hand to Jean Manget's great bombard, which burst, as you know, on the day when it was tested, on the Pont de Charenton, and killed 24 curious spectators. You see that I am not a bad match in marriage. I know a great many sorts of very engaging tricks, which I will teach your goat. For example, to mimic the Bishop of Paris, that cursed Pharisee whose mill-wheels splash passers-by the whole length of the Pont aux Meuniers. And then my mystery will bring me in a great deal of coined money, if they will only pay me. And finally, I am at your orders, I and my wits, and my science, and my letters, ready to live with you, damsel, as it shall please you, chastely or joyously, husband and wife if you see fit, brother and sister if you think that better." Gringoire ceased, awaiting the effect of his harangue on the young girl. Her eyes were fixed on the ground. "Phoebus," she said in a low voice. Then, turning towards the poet, "Phoebus, what does that mean?" Gringoire, without exactly understanding what the connection could be between his address and this question, was not sorry to display his erudition. Assuming an air of importance, he replied, "It is a Latin word which means sun." "Sun," she repeated. "It is the name of a handsome archer, who was a god," added Gringoire. "A god," repeated the gypsy, and there was something pensive and passionate in her tone. At that moment one of her bracelets became unfastened and fell. Gringoire stooped quickly to pick it up. When he straightened up, the young girl and the goat had disappeared. He heard the sound of a bolt. It was a little door, communicating no doubt with a neighboring cell, which was being fastened on the outside. "Has she left me a bed, at least?" said our philosopher. He made a tour of his cell. There was no piece of furniture adapted to sleeping purposes, except a tolerably long wooden coffer, and its cover was carved to boot, which afforded Gringoire, when he stretched himself out upon it, a sensation somewhat similar to that which Macromegos would feel if he were to lie down on the Alps. "Come," said he, adjusting himself as well as possible, "I must resign myself. But here's a strange nuptial night. 'Tis a pity. There was something innocent and antediluvian about that broken crock which quite pleased me." End of Chapter 7. Book Third, Chapter 1 of The Hunchback of Notre Dame by Victor Hugo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book Third, Chapter 1 Notre Dame. The Church of Notre Dame de Paris is still no doubt a majestic and sublime edifice. But, beautiful as it has been preserved in growing old, it is difficult not to sigh, not to wax indignant before the numberless degradations and mutilations which time and men have both caused the venerable monument to suffer, without respect for Charlemagne, who laid its first stone, or for Philip Augustus, who laid the last. On the face of this aged queen of our cathedrals, by the side of a wrinkle, one always finds a scar. Tempus edax, homo edacior, which I should be glad to translate thus: time is blind, man is stupid. If we had leisure to examine with the reader, one by one, the diverse traces of destruction imprinted upon the old church, time's share would be the least, the share of men the most, especially the men of art, since there have been individuals who assumed the title of architects during the last 2 centuries. And in the first place, to cite only a few leading examples, there certainly are few finer architectural pages than this façade, where, successively and at once, the 3 portals hollowed out in an arch, the broidered and dentated cordon of the 28 royal niches, the immense central rose window, flanked by its 2 lateral windows, like a priest by his deacon and sub-deacon, the frail and lofty gallery of trefoil arcades, which supports a heavy platform above its fine, slender columns, and lastly, the 2 black and massive towers with their slate penthouses, harmonious parts of a magnificent whole, superposed in 5 gigantic stories, develop themselves before the eye in a mass and without confusion, with their innumerable details of statuary, carving, and sculpture, joined powerfully to the tranquil grandeur of the whole. A vast symphony in stone, so to speak, the colossal work of one man and one people, altogether one and complex, like the Iliads and the Romanceros, whose sister it is, prodigious product of the grouping together of all the forces of an epoch, where, upon each stone, one sees the fancy of the workman, disciplined by the genius of the artist, start forth in 100 fashions. A sort of human creation, in a word, powerful and fecund as the divine creation of which it seems to have stolen the double character, variety, eternity. And what we here say of the façade must be said of the entire church. And what we say of the Cathedral Church of Paris must be said of all the churches of Christendom in the Middle Ages. All things are in place in that art, self-created, logical, and well-proportioned. To measure the great toe of the foot is to measure the giant. Let us return to the façade of Notre Dame, as it still appears to us, when we go piously to admire the grave and puissant cathedral, which inspires terror, so its chronicles assert. Quae molle sua terrarum incutit spectantibus. 3 important things are today lacking in that façade. In the first place, the staircase of 11 steps, which formerly raised it above the soil. Next, the lower series of statues, which occupied the niches of the 3 portals. And lastly, the upper series, of the 28 most ancient kings of France, which garnish the gallery of the first story, beginning with Childebert and ending with Philip Augustus, holding in his hand the imperial apple. Time has caused the staircase to disappear, by raising the soil of the city with a slow and irresistible progress. But, while thus causing the 11 steps, which added to the majestic height of the edifice, to be devoured, one by the rising tide of the pavements of Paris, time has bestowed upon the church perhaps more than it has taken away. For it is time which has spread over the façade that sombre hue of the centuries which makes the old age of monuments the period of their beauty. But who has thrown down the 2 rows of statues? Who has left the niches empty? Who has cut, in the very middle of the central portal, that new and bastard arch? Who has dared to frame therein that commonplace and heavy door of carved wood, à la Louis XV, beside the arabesques of Biscornet? The men, the architects, the artists of our day. And if we enter the interior of the edifice, who has overthrown that colossus of St. Christopher, proverbial for magnitude among statues, as the grand hall of the Palais de Justice was among halls, as the spire of Strasbourg among spires? And those myriads of statues, which peopled all the spaces between the columns of the nave and the choir, kneeling, standing, equestrian, men, women, children, kings, bishops, gendarmes in stone, in marble, in gold, in silver, and copper, in wax even, who has brutally swept them away? It is not time. And who substituted for the ancient Gothic altar, splendidly encumbered with shrines and reliquaries, that heavy marble sarcophagus, with angels' heads and clouds, which seems a specimen pillaged from the Val de Grace or the Invalides? Who stupidly sealed the heavy anachronism of stone in the Carlovingian pavement of Hercandus? Was it not Louis XIV, fulfilling the request of Louis XIII? And who put the cold white panes in the place of those windows high in color, which caused the astonished eyes of our fathers to hesitate between the rows of the grand portal and the arches of the apse? And what would a sub-chanter of the 16th century say, on beholding the beautiful yellow wash with which our archiepiscopal Vandals have besmeared their cathedral? He would remember that it was the color with which the hangman smeared accursed edifices. He would recall the Hôtel de Petit Bourbon, all smeared thus on account of the constable's treason. Yellow, after all, of so good a quality, said Sauval, and so well recommended, that more than a century has not yet caused it to lose its color. He would think that the sacred place had become infamous, and would flee. And if we ascend the cathedral, without mentioning 1,000 barbarisms of every sort, What has become of that charming little bell tower which rested upon the point of intersection of the cross roofs, and which, no less frail and no less bold than its neighbour, also destroyed, the spire of the Sainte Chapelle, buried itself in the sky, farther forward than the towers, slender, pointed, sonorous, carved in open work? An architect of good taste amputated it, 1787, and considered it sufficient to mask the wound with that large leaden plaster which resembles a pot-cover. 'Tis thus that the marvellous art of the Middle Ages has been treated in nearly every country, especially in France. One can distinguish on its ruins 3 sorts of lesions, all 3 of which cut into it at different depths. First, time, which has insensibly notched its surface here and there, and gnawed it everywhere. Next, political and religious revolution, which, blind and wrathful by nature, have flung themselves tumultuously upon it, torn its rich garment of carving and sculpture, burst its rose windows, broken its necklace of arabesques and tiny figures, torn out its statues, sometimes because of their mitres, sometimes because of their crowns. Lastly, fashions, even more grotesque and foolish, which, since the anarchical and splendid deviations of the Renaissance, have followed each other in the necessary decadence of architecture. Fashions have wrought more harm than revolutions. They have cut to the quick. They have attacked the very bone and framework of art. They have cut, slashed, disorganized, killed the edifice, in form as in the symbol, in its consistency as well as in its beauty. And then they have made it over, a presumption of which neither time nor revolutions at least have been guilty. They have audaciously adjusted, in the name of good taste, upon the wounds of Gothic architecture, their miserable gewgaws of a day, their ribbons of marble, their pompons of metal, a veritable leprosy of egg-shaped ornaments, volutes, whorls, draperies, garlands, fringes, stone flames, bronze clouds, pudgy cupids, chubby-cheeked cherubim, which begin to devour the face of art in the oratory of Catherine de' Medici, and cause it to expire, 2 centuries later, tortured and grimacing in the boudoir of the Du Barry. Thus, to sum up the points which we have just indicated, 3 sorts of ravages today disfigure Gothic architecture. Wrinkles and warts on the epidermis, this is the work of time. Deeds of violence, brutalities, contusions, fractures, this is the work of the revolutionaries, from Luther to Mirabeau. Mutilations, amputations, dislocation of the joints, restorations, this is the Greek, Roman, and barbarian work of professors, according to Vitruvius and Vignole. This magnificent art produced by the Vandals has been slain by the academies. The centuries, the revolutions, which at least devastate with impartiality and grandeur, have been joined by a cloud of school architects, licensed, sworn, and bound by oath, defacing with the discernment and choice of bad taste, substituting the chicories of Louis XV for the Gothic lace, for the greater glory of the Parthenon. It is the kick of the ass at the dying lion. It is the old oak crowning itself, and which, to heap the measure full, is stung, bitten, and gnawed by caterpillars. How far it is from the epoch when Robert Sennelier, comparing Notre Dame de Paris to the famous temple of Diana at Ephesus, so much lauded by the ancient pagans, which Herostratus has immortalized from the Gallic temple, more excellent in length, breadth, height, and structure. Notre Dame is not, moreover, what can be called a complete, definite, classified monument. It is no longer a Romanesque church, nor is it a Gothic church. This edifice is not a type. Notre Dame de Paris has not, like the Abbey of Tournus, the grave and massive frame, the large and round vault, the glacial bareness, the majestic simplicity of the edifices which have the rounded arch for their progenitor. It is not, like the Cathedral of Bourges, the magnificent, light, multiform, tufted, bristling, efflorescent product of the pointed arch. Impossible to class it in that ancient family of sombre, mysterious churches, low and crushed, as it were, by the round arch, almost Egyptian, with the exception of the ceiling. All hieroglyphics, all sacerdotal, all symbolical, more loaded in their ornaments, with lozenges and zigzags than with flowers than with animals than with men. The work of the architect less than of the bishop. First transformation of art, all impressed with theocratic and military discipline, taking root in the Lower Empire, and stopping with the time of William the Conqueror. Impossible to place our cathedral in that other family of lofty aerial churches, rich in painted windows and sculpture. Pointed in form, bold in attitude. Communal and bourgeois as political symbols. Free, capricious, lawless as a work of art. Second transformation of architecture, no longer hieroglyphic, immovable, and sacerdotal, but artistic, progressive, and popular, which begins at the return of the Crusades and ends with Louis IX. Notre Dame de Paris is not of pure Romanesque, like the first, nor of pure Arabian race, like the second. It is an edifice of the transition period. The Saxon architect completed the erection of the first pillars of the nave when the pointed arch, which dates from the Crusade, arrived and placed itself, as a conqueror, upon the large Romanesque capitals which should support only round arches. The pointed arch, mistress since that time, constructed the rest of the church. Nevertheless, timid and inexperienced at the start, it sweeps out, grows larger, restrains itself, and dares no longer dart upwards in spires and lancet windows, as it did later on in so many marvelous cathedrals. One would say that it were conscious of the vicinity of the heavy Romanesque pillars. However, these edifices of the transition from the Romanesque to the Gothic are no less precious for study than the pure types. They express a shade of the art which would be lost without them. It is the graft of the pointed upon the round arch. Notre Dame de Paris is in particular a curious specimen of this variety. Each face, each stone of the venerable monument, is a page not only of the history of the country, but of the history of science and art as well. Thus, in order to indicate here only the principal details, while the little red door almost attains to the limits of the Gothic delicacy of the 15th century, the pillars of the nave, by their size and weight, go back to the Carlovingian abbey of the Saint-Germain-des-Prés. One would suppose that 6 centuries separated these pillars from that door. There is no one, not even the Hermetics, who does not find in the symbols of the Grand Portal a satisfactory compendium of their science, of which the church of Saint-Jacques de la Boucherie was so complete a hieroglyph. Thus the Roman abbey, the philosopher's church, the Gothic art, Saxon art, the heavy round pillar which recalls Gregory VII, the Hermetic symbolism, with which Nicolas Flamel played the prelude to Luther, papal unity, schism, Saint-Germain-des-Prés, Saint-Jacques de la Boucherie, all are mingled, combined, amalgamated in Notre Dame. This central mother church is, among the ancient churches of Paris, a sort of chimera. It has the head of one, the limbs of another, the haunches of another, something of all. We repeat it. These hybrid constructions are not the least interesting for the artist, for the antiquarian, for the historian. They make one feel to what a degree architecture is a primitive thing, by demonstrating, what is also demonstrated by the Cyclopean vestiges, the pyramids of Egypt, the gigantic Hindu pagodas, that the greatest products of architecture are less the works of individuals than of society. Rather the offspring of a nation's effort than the inspired flash of a man of genius, the deposit left by a whole people, the heaps accumulated by centuries, the residue of successive evaporations of human society, in a word, species of formations. Each wave of time contributes its alluvium, each race deposits its layer on the monument, each individual brings his stone. Thus do the beavers, thus do the bees, thus do men. The great symbol of architecture, Babel, is a hive. Great edifices, like great mountains, are the work of centuries. Art often undergoes a transformation while they are pending, pendent opera interrupta. They proceed quietly in accordance with the transformed art. The new art takes the monument where it finds it, incrusts itself there, assimilates it to itself, develops it according to its fancy, and finishes it if it can. The thing is accomplished without trouble, without effort, without reaction, following a natural and tranquil law. It is a graft which shoots up, a sap which circulates, a vegetation which starts forth anew. Certainly there is matter here for many large volumes, and often the universal history of humanity in the successive engrafting of many arts at many levels upon the same monument. The man, the artist, the individual, is effaced in these great masses, which lack the name of their author. Human intelligence is there summed up and totalized. Time is the architect, the nation is the builder. Not to consider here anything except the Christian architecture of Europe, that younger sister of the great masonries of the Orient, it appears to the eyes as an immense formation divided into three well-defined zones, which are superposed, the one upon the other: the Romanesque zone, the Gothic zone, the zone of the Renaissance, which we would gladly call the Greco-Roman zone. The Roman layer, which is the most ancient and deepest, is occupied by the round arch, which reappears, supported by the Greek column, in the modern and upper layer of the Renaissance. The pointed arch is found between the two. The edifices which belong exclusively to any of these three layers are perfectly distinct, uniform, and complete. There is the Abbey of Jumièges, there is the Cathedral of Rheims, there is the Sainte Croix of Orleans. But the three zones mingle and amalgamate along the edges, like the colors in the solar spectrum. Hence, complex monuments, edifices of gradation and transition. One is Roman at the base, Gothic in the middle, Greco-Roman at the top. It is because it was 600 years in building. This variety is rare. The Donjon Keep of d'Etampes is a specimen of it. But monuments of two formations are more frequent. There is Notre Dame de Paris, a pointed arch edifice, which is embedded by its pillars in that Roman zone, in which are plunged the portal of Saint Denis and the nave of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. There is the charming, half-Gothic chapter house of Beaucherville, where the Roman layer extends halfway up. There is the Cathedral of Rouen, which would be entirely Gothic if it did not bathe the tip of its central spire in the zone of the Renaissance. However, all these shades, all these differences, do not affect the surfaces of edifices only. It is art which has changed its skin. The very constitution of the Christian Church is not attacked by it. There is always the same internal woodwork, the same logical arrangement of parts. Whatever may be the carved and embroidered envelope of a cathedral, one always finds beneath it, in the state of a germ and of a rudiment at the least, the Roman basilica. It is eternally developed upon the soil according to the same law. There are, invariably, two naves, which intersect in a cross, and whose upper portion, rounded into an apse, forms the choir. There are always the side aisles, for interior processions, for chapels, a sort of lateral walks or promenades, where the principal nave discharges itself through the space between the pillars. That settled, the number of chapels, doors, bell towers, and pinnacles are modified to infinity, according to the fancy of the century, the people, and art. The service of religion once assured and provided for, architecture does what she pleases. Statues, stained glass, rose windows, arabesques, denticulations, capitals, bas-reliefs, she combines all of these imaginings according to the arrangement which best suits her. Hence the prodigious exterior variety of these edifices, at whose foundation dwells so much order and unity. The trunk of a tree is immovable, the foliage is capricious. End of Chapter 1. Book 3, Chapter 2 of The Hunchback of Notre Dame, by Victor Hugo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 3, Chapter 2 A Bird's Eye View of Paris. We have just attempted to restore, for the reader's benefit, that admirable church of Notre Dame de Paris. We have briefly pointed out the greater part of the beauties which it possessed in the 15th century, and which it lacks today. But we have omitted the principal thing, the view of Paris which was then to be obtained from the summits of its towers. That was, in fact, when, after having long groped one's way up the dark spiral which perpendicularly pierces the thick wall of the belfries, one emerged, at last abruptly, upon one of the lofty platforms inundated with light and air. That was, in fact, a fine picture which spread out on all sides at once before the eye. A spectacle, sui generis, of which those of our readers who have had the good fortune to see a Gothic city entire, complete, homogeneous, a few of which still remain, Nuremberg in Bavaria and Vittoria in Spain, can readily form an idea, or even smaller specimens, provided that they are well preserved, Vitré in Brittany, Nordhausen in Prussia. The Paris of 350 years ago, the Paris of the 15th century, was already a gigantic city. We Parisians generally make a mistake as to the ground which we think that we have gained, since Paris has not increased much over 1/3 since the time of Louis XI. It has certainly lost more in beauty than it has gained in size. Paris had its birth, as the reader knows, in that old island of the city which has the form of a cradle. The strand of that island was its first boundary wall, the Seine its first moat. Paris remained for many centuries in its island state, with two bridges, one on the north, the other on the south, and two bridgeheads, which were at the same time its gates and its fortresses, the Grand Châtelet on the right bank, the Petit Châtelet on the left. Then, from the date of the kings of the first race, Paris, being too cribbed and confined in its island, and unable to return thither, crossed the water. Then, beyond the Grand, beyond the Petit Châtelet, a first circle of walls and towers began to infringe upon the country on the two sides of the Seine. Some vestiges of this ancient enclosure still remain in the last century. Today, only the memory of it is left, and here and there a tradition, the Baudets or Baudoyer Gate, Porte Pagoda. Little by little, the tide of houses, always thrust from the center of the city outwards, overflows, devours, wears away, and defaces this wall. Philippe Augustus makes a new dike for it. He imprisons Paris in a circular chain of great towers, both lofty and solid. For the period of more than a century the houses press upon each other, accumulate and raise their level in this basin, like water in a reservoir. They begin to deepen. They pile story upon story. They mount upon each other. They gush forth at the top, like all laterally compressed growth, and there is a rivalry as to which shall thrust its head above its neighbors for the sake of getting a little air. The street glows narrower and deeper, every space is overwhelmed and disappears. The houses finally leap the wall of Philippe Augustus and scatter joyfully over the plain, without order and all askew, like runaways. They plant themselves squarely, cut themselves gardens from the fields, and take their ease. Beginning with 1367, the city spreads to such an extent into the suburbs that a new wall becomes necessary, particularly on the right bank. Charles V builds it. But a city like Paris is perpetually growing. It is only such cities that become capitals. They are funnels, into which all the geographical, political, moral, and intellectual watersheds of a country, all the natural slopes of a people pour. Wells of civilization, so to speak, and also sewers, where commerce, industry, intelligence, population, all that is sap, all that is life, all that is the soul of a nation, filters and amasses unceasingly, drop by drop, century by century. So Charles V's wall suffered the fate of that of Philippe Augustus. At the end of the 15th century, the Faubourg strides across it, passes beyond it, and runs farther. In the 16th, it seems to retreat visibly, and to bury itself deeper and deeper in the old city, so thick had the new city already become outside of it. Thus, beginning with the 15th century, where our story finds us, Paris had already outgrown the 3 concentric circles of walls which, from the time of Julian the Apostate, existed, so to speak, in germ in the Grand Châtelet and the Petit Châtelet. The mighty city had cracked in succession its 4 enclosures of walls, like a child grown too large for his garments of last year. Under Louis XI, this sea of houses was seen to be pierced at intervals by several groups of ruined towers from the ancient wall, like the summits of hills in an inundation, like archipelagos of the old Paris submerged beneath the new. Since that time, Paris has undergone yet another transformation, unfortunately for our eyes, but it has passed only one more wall, that of Louis XV, that miserable wall of mud and spittle, worthy of the king who built it, worthy of the poet who sung it, Les murs mirant, Paris rend Paris murmurant. The walling Paris makes Paris murmur. In the 15th century, Paris was still divided into 3 wholly distinct and separate towns, each having its own physiognomy, its own specialty, its manners, customs, privileges, and history: the city, the university, the town. The city, which occupied the island, was the most ancient, the smallest, and the mother of the other 2, crowded in between them like, may we be pardoned the comparison, a little old woman between 2 large and handsome maidens. The university covered the left bank of the Seine, from the Tournelle to the Tour de Nesle, points which correspond in the Paris of today, the one to the wine market, the other to the mint. Its wall included a large part of that plain where Julian had built his hot baths. The hill of Sainte-Geneviève was enclosed in it. The culminating point of this sweep of walls was the Papal Gate, that is to say, near the present site of the Pantheon. The town, which was the largest of the 3 fragments of Paris, held the right bank. Its quay, broken or interrupted in many places, ran along the Seine, from the Tour de Billy to the Tour de Bois, that is to say, from the place where the granary stands today to the present site of the Tuileries. These 4 points, where the Seine intersected the wall of the capital, the Tournelle and the Tour de Nesle on the right, and the Tour de Billy and the Tour de Bois on the left, were called, preeminently, the 4 Towers of Paris. The town encroached still more extensively upon the fields than the university. The culminating point of the town wall, that of Charles V, was at the gates of Saint-Denis and Saint-Martin, whose situation has not been changed. As we have just said, each of these 3 great divisions of Paris was a town, but too special a town to be complete, a city which could not get along with the other 2. Hence 3 entirely distinct aspects. Churches abounded in the city, palaces in the town, and colleges in the university. Neglecting here the originalities, of secondary importance in old Paris, and the capricious regulations regarding the public highways, we will say, from a general point of view, taking only masses and the whole group, in this chaos of communal jurisdictions, that the island belonged to the bishop, the right bank to the provost of the merchants, the left bank to the rector. Over all ruled the provost of Paris, a royal, not a municipal office. The city had Notre Dame, the town the Louvre, and the Hôtel de Ville, the university the Sorbonne. The town had the markets, the city the hospital, the university the Pré aux Clercs. Offenses committed by the scholars on the left bank were tried in the law courts on the island, and were punished on the right bank at Montfaucon, unless the rector, feeling the university to be strong and the king weak, intervened, for it was the students' privilege to be hanged on their own grounds. The greater part of these privileges, it may be noted in passing, and there were some even better than the above, had been extorted from the kings by revolts and mutinies. It is the course of things from time immemorial. The king only lets go when the people tear away. There is an old charter which puts the matter naively, apropos of fidelity. Civibus fidelitas in reges, quae tamen aliquotias sediti onibus interrupta multa peperit privilegia. In the 15th century, the Seine bathed 5 islands within the walls of Paris. Louviers Island, where there were then trees, and where there is no longer anything but wood; l'Île aux Vaches and l'Île Notre Dame, both deserted, with the exception of one house, both fiefs of the bishop. In the 17th century a single island was formed out of these 2, which was built upon and named l'Île Saint Louis. Lastly the city, and at its point, the little islet of the Cow Tender, which was afterwards engulfed beneath the platform of the Pont Neuf. The city then had 5 bridges, 3 on the right, the Pont Notre Dame and the Pont au Change of stone, the Pont au Meunier of wood; 2 on the left, the Petit Pont of stone and the Pont Saint-Michel of wood, all loaded with houses. The university had 6 gates, built by Philippe Augustus. There were, beginning with La Tournelle, the Porte Saint-Victor, the Porte Bourdelle, the Porte Papale, the Porte Saint-Jacques, the Porte Saint-Michel, the Porte Saint-Germain. The town had 6 gates, built by Charles V. Beginning with the Tour de Billy, they were the Porte Saint-Antoine, the Porte du Temple, the Porte Saint-Martin, the Porte Saint-Denis, the Porte Montmartre, the Porte Saint-Honoré. All these gates were strong and also handsome, which does not detract from strength. A large deep moat, with a brisk current during the high water of winter, bathed the base of the wall round Paris. The Seine furnished the water. At night the gates were shut, the river was barred at both ends of the city with huge iron chains, and Paris slept tranquilly. From a bird's-eye view, these 3 burghs, the city, the town, and the university, each presented to the eye an inextricable skein of eccentrically tangled streets. Nevertheless, at first sight, one recognized the fact that these 3 fragments formed but one body. One immediately perceived 3 long parallel streets, unbroken, undisturbed, traversing, almost in a straight line, all 3 cities, from one end to the other, from north to south, perpendicularly to the Seine, which bound them together, mingled them, infused them in each other, poured and transfused the people incessantly from one to the other, and made one out of the 3. The first of these streets ran from the Porte Saint-Martin. It was called the Rue Saint-Jacques in the university, Rue de la Juiverie in the city, Rue Saint-Martin in the town. It crossed the water twice, under the name of the Petit Pont and the Pont Notre Dame. The second, which was called the Rue de la Harpe on the left bank, Rue de la Barillerie on the island, Rue Saint-Denis on the right bank, Pont Saint-Michel on one arm of the Seine, Pont au Change on the other, ran from the Porte Saint-Michel in the university to the Porte Saint-Denis in the town. However, under all these names, there were but 2 streets, parent streets, generating streets, the 2 arteries of Paris. All the other veins of the triple city either derived their supply from them or emptied into them. Independently of these 2 principal streets, piercing Paris diametrically in its whole breadth from side to side, common to the entire capital, the city and the university had also each its own great special street, which ran lengthwise by them, parallel to the Seine, cutting, as it passed, at right angles the two arterial thoroughfares. Thus, in the town, one descended in a straight line from the Porte Saint-Antoine to the Porte Saint-Honoré; in the university, from the Porte Saint-Victor to the Porte Saint-Germain. These two great thoroughfares, intersected by the two first, formed the canvas upon which reposed, knotted and crowded together on every hand, the labyrinthine network of the streets of Paris. In the incomprehensible plan of these streets, one distinguished likewise, on looking attentively, two clusters of great streets, like magnified sheaves of grain, one in the university, the other in the town, which spread out gradually from the bridges to the gates. Some traces of this geometrical plan still exist today. Now, what aspect did this whole present when, as viewed from the summit of the towers of Notre Dame in 1482? That we shall try to describe. For the spectator who arrived panting upon that pinnacle, it was first a dazzling, confusing view of roofs, chimneys, streets, bridges, places, spires, bell towers. Everything struck your eye at once: the carved gable, the pointed roof, the turrets suspended at the angles of the walls, the stone pyramids of the 11th century, the slate obelisks of the 15th, the round, bare tower of the Donjon Keep, the square and fretted tower of the church, the great and the little, the massive and the aerial. The eye was for a long time wholly lost in this labyrinth, where there was nothing which did not possess its originality, its reason, its genius, its beauty; nothing which did not proceed from art. Beginning with the smallest house, with its painted and carved front, with external beams, elliptical door, with projecting stories, to the Royal Louvre, which then had a colonnade of towers. But these are the principal masses which were then to be distinguished when the eye began to accustom itself to this tumult of edifices. In the first place, the city. The island of the city, as Sauval says, who, in spite of his confused medley, sometimes has such happy turns of expression. The island of the city is made like a great ship, stuck in the mud and run aground in the current near the center of the Seine. We have just explained that, in the 15th century, this ship was anchored to the two banks of the river by 5 bridges. This form of a ship had also struck the heraldic scribes. For it is from that, and not from the siege by the Normans, that the ship which blazons the old shield of Paris comes, according to Favin and Pasquier. For him who understands how to decipher them, armorial bearings are algebra, armorial bearings have a tongue. The whole history of the second half of the Middle Ages is written in armorial bearings. The first half is in the symbolism of the Roman churches. They are the hieroglyphics of feudalism, succeeding those of theocracy. Thus the city first presented itself to the eye, with its stern to the east and its prow to the west. Turning towards the prow, one had before one an innumerable flock of ancient roofs, over which arched broadly the lead-covered apse of the Sainte-Chapelle, like an elephant's haunches loaded with its tower. Only here, this tower was the most audacious, the most open, the most ornamented spire of cabinet-maker's work that ever let the sky peep through its cone of lace. In front of Notre Dame, and very near at hand, 3 streets opened into the cathedral square, a fine square lined with ancient houses. Over the south side of this place bent the wrinkled and sullen façade of the Hôtel Dieu, and its roof which seemed covered with warts and pustules. Then, on the right and the left, to the east and west, within that wall of the city, which was yet so contracted, rose the bell towers of its 21 churches, of every date, of every form, of every size, from the low and worm-eaten belfry of the Saint-Denis-du-Pas to the slender needles of Saint-Pierre-aux-Boeufs and Saint-Landry. Behind Notre Dame, the cloister and its Gothic gallery spread out towards the north. On the south, the half-Roman palace of the bishop. On the east, the desert point of the Touraine. In this throng of houses the eye also distinguished, by the lofty open-work mitres of stone which then crowned the roof itself, even the most elevated windows of the palace, the hotel given by the city under Charles VI to Juvenal des Ursins. A little farther on, the pitched covered sheds of the Palais Market. In still another quarter, the new apse of the Saint-Germain-l'Auvieux, lengthened in 1458, with a bit of the Rue aux Fabres. And then, in places, a square crowded with people, a pillory erected at the corner of a street, a fine fragment of the pavement of Philippe Augustus, a magnificent flagging, grooved for the horses' feet in the middle of the road, and so badly replaced in the 16th century by the miserable cobblestones, called the Pavement of the League, a deserted back courtyard, with one of those diaphanous staircase turrets, such as were erected in the 15th century, one of which is still to be seen in the Rue des Bourdonnais. Lastly, at the right of the Sainte-Chapelle towards the west, the Place de Justice rested its group of towers at the edge of the water. The thickets of the King's Gardens, which covered the western point of the city, masked the island de Passeur. As for the water, from the summit of the towers of Notre Dame one hardly saw it, on either side of the city. The Seine was hidden by bridges, the bridges by houses. And when the glance passed these bridges, whose roofs were visibly green, rendered mouldy before their time by the vapors of the water, if it was directed to the left, towards the University, the first edifice which struck it was a large, low sheaf of towers, the Petit Châtelet, whose yawning gate devoured the end of the Petit Pont. Then, if your view ran along the bank from east to west, from the Tournelle to the Tour de Nesle, there was a long cordon of houses, with carved beams, stained-glass windows, each story projecting over that beneath it, an interminable zigzag of bourgeois gables, frequently interrupted by the mouth of a street, and from time to time also by the front or angle of a huge stone mansion, planted at its ease, with courts and gardens, wings and detached buildings, amid this populace of crowded and narrow houses, like a grand gentleman among a throng of rustics. There were 5 or 6 of these mansions on the quay, from the House of Lorraine, which shared with the Bernardins the grand enclosure adjoining the Tournelle to the Hôtel de Nesle, whose principal tower ended Paris, and whose pointed roofs were in a position during 3 months of the year to encroach, with their black triangles, upon the scarlet disk of the setting sun. This side of the Seine was, however, the last mercantile of the two. Students furnished more of a crowd and more noise there than artisans, and there was not, properly speaking, any quay except from the Pont Saint-Michel to the Tour de Nesle. The rest of the bank of the Seine was now a naked strand, the same as beyond the Bernardin. Again a throng of houses, standing with their feet in the water as between the two bridges. There was a great uproar of laundresses. They screamed and talked and sang from morning till night along the beach, and beat a great deal of linen there, just as in our day. This is not the least of the gaieties of Paris. The University presented a dense mass to the eye. From one end to the other it was homogeneous and compact. The 1,000 roofs, dense, angular, clinging to each other, composed nearly all of the same geometrical element, offered, when viewed from above, the aspect of a crystallization of the same substance. The capricious ravine of streets did not cut this block of houses into 2 disproportionate slices. The 42 colleges were scattered about in a fairly equal manner, and there were some everywhere. The amusingly varied crests of these beautiful edifices were the product of the same art as the simple roofs which they overshot, and were actually only a multiplication of the square or the cube of the same geometrical figure. Hence they complicated the whole effect without disturbing it, completed without overloading it. Geometry is harmony. Some fine mansions here and there made magnificent outlines against the picturesque attics of the left bank. The House of Nevers, the House of Rome, the House of Rheims, which have disappeared. The Hôtel du Cluny, which still exists, for the consolation of the artist, and whose tower was so stupidly deprived of its crown a few years ago. Close to Cluny, that Roman palace, with fine round arches, were once the hot baths of Julian. There were a great many abbeys, of a beauty more devout, of a grandeur more solemn than the mansions, but not less beautiful, not less grand. Those which first caught the eye were the Bernardins, with their 3 bell towers; Sainte Geneviève, whose square tower, which still exists, makes us regret the rest; the Sorbonne, half college, half monastery, of which so admirable a nave survives; the fine quadrilateral cloister of the Mathurins, its neighbor the cloister of Saint Benoît, within whose walls they have had time to cobble up a theatre, between the 7th and 8th editions of this book; the Cordeliers, with their 3 enormous adjacent gables; the Augustins, whose graceful spire formed, after the Tour de Nesle, the second denticulation of this side of Paris, starting from the west; the colleges, which are in fact the intermediate ring between the cloister and the world, hold the middle position in the monumental series between the Hôtel and the abbeys, with a severity full of elegance, sculpture less giddy than the palaces, and architecture less severe than the convents. Unfortunately, hardly anything remains of these monuments, where Gothic art combined with so just a balance, richness and economy. The churches, and they were numerous and splendid in the university, and they were graded there also in all the ages of architecture, from the round arches of Saint Julien to the pointed arches of Saint Severin. The churches dominated the whole. And, like one harmony more in this mass of harmonies, they pierced in quick succession the multiple open-work of the gables with slashed spires, with open-work bell-towers with slender pinnacles, whose line was also only a magnificent exaggeration of the acute angle of the roofs. The ground of the university was hilly. Mount Sainte-Geneviève formed an enormous mound to the south, and it was a sight to see from the summit of Notre Dame how that throng of narrow and tortuous streets, today the Latin Quarter, whose bunches of houses, which, spread out in every direction from the top of this eminence, precipitated themselves in disorder, and almost perpendicularly down its flanks, nearly to the water's edge, having the air, some of falling, others of clambering up again, and all of holding to one another. A continual flux of 1,000 black points, which passed each other on the pavements, made everything move before the eyes. It was the populace seen thus from aloft and afar. Lastly, in the intervals of these roofs, of these spires, of these accidents of numberless edifices, which bent and writhed and jagged in so eccentric a manner the extreme line of the university, one caught a glimpse, here and there, of a great expanse of moss-grown wall, a thick round tower, a crenellated city gate, shadowing forth the fortress. It was the wall of Philippe Augustus. Beyond, the fields gleamed green. Beyond fled the roads, along which were scattered a few more suburban houses, which became more infrequent as they became more distant. Some of these faubourgs were important. There were, first, starting from La Tournelle, the Bourg Saint-Victor, with its one arch-bridge over the Bièvre, its abbey where one could read the epitaph of Louis le Gros, Epitaphium Lodovici Grossi, and its church with an octagonal spire, flanked with 4 little bell-towers of the 11th century. A similar one can be seen at Étampes. It is not yet destroyed. Next, the Bourg Saint-Marceau, which already had 3 churches and 1 convent. Then, leaving the mill of the Gobelins and its 4 white walls on the left, there was the Faubourg Saint-Jacques, with the beautiful carved cross in its square. The church of Saint-Jacques du Haut-Pas, which was then Gothic, pointed, charming. Saint-Marois, a fine nave of the 14th century, which Napoleon turned into a hayloft. Notre-Dame des Champs, where there were Byzantine mosaics. Lastly, after having left behind, full in the country, the monastery des Chartreux, a rich edifice contemporary with the Palais de Justice, with its little garden divided into compartments, and the haunted ruins of Vauvert. The eye fell to the west upon the 3 Roman spires of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. The Bourg Saint-Germain, already a large community, formed 15 or 20 streets in the rear. The pointed bell of Saint-Sulpice marked one corner of the town. Close beside it one descried the quadrilateral enclosure of the Fair of Saint-Germain, where the market is situated today. Then the abbot's pillory, a pretty little round tower, well capped with a leaden cone. The brickyard was further on, and the Rue de Four, which led to the common bakehouse, and the mill on its hillock, and the Lézard house, a tiny house, isolated and half seen. But that which attracted the eye most of all, and fixed it for a long time on that point, was the abbey itself. It is certain that this monastery, which had a grand air, both as a church and as a seigneury, that abbatial palace where the bishops of Paris counted themselves happy if they could pass the night, that refectory upon which the architect had bestowed the air, the beauty, and the rose window of a cathedral, that elegant chapel of the Virgin, that monumental dormitory, those vast gardens, that portcullis, that drawbridge, that envelope of battlements which notched to the eye the verdure of the surrounding meadows, those courtyards where gleamed men-at-arms intermingled with golden copes. The whole grouped and clustered about 3 lofty spires with round arches, well planted upon a Gothic apse, made a magnificent figure against the horizon. When, at length, after having contemplated the university for a long time, you turned towards the right bank, towards the town, the character of the spectacle was abruptly altered. The town, in fact much larger than the university, was also less of a unit. At the first glance one saw that it was divided into many masses, singularly distinct. First, to the eastward, in that part of the town which still takes its name from the marsh where the Camulogene entangled Caesar, was a pile of palaces. The block extended to the very water's edge. 4 almost contiguous hotels, Jouet, Sans Barbeau, the House of the Queen, mirrored their slate peaks, broken their slender turrets in the Seine. These 4 edifices filled the space from the Rue des Nonandières to the Abbey of the Célestins, whose spire gracefully relieved their line of gables and battlements. A few miserable greenish hovels, hanging over the water in front of the sumptuous hotel, did not prevent one from seeing the fine angles of their facades, their large square windows with stone mullions, their pointed porches overloaded with statues, the vivid outlines of their walls, always clear-cut, and all those charming accidents of architecture which cause Gothic art to have the air of beginning in its combinations afresh with every monument. Behind these palaces, extended in all directions, now broken, fenced in, battlemented like a citadel, now veiled by great trees like a Carthusian convent, the immense and multiform enclosure of that miraculous Hôtel de Saint Paul, where the King of France possessed the means of lodging superbly 22 princes of the rank of the Dauphin and the Duke of Burgundy, with their domestics and their suites, without counting the great lords, and the Emperor when he came to view Paris, and the Lions, who had their separate hôtel at the Royal Hotel. Let us say here that a prince's apartment was then composed of never less than 11 large rooms, from the chamber of state to the oratory, not to mention the galleries, baths, vapor baths, and other superfluous places, with which each apartment was provided, not to mention the private gardens for each of the king's guests, not to mention the kitchens, the cellars, the domestic offices, the general refectories of the house, the poultry yards, where there were 22 general laboratories, from the bakehouses to the wine cellars, games of 1,000 sorts, malls, tennis, and riding at the ring, aviaries, fish ponds, menageries, stables, barns, libraries, arsenals, and foundries. This was what a king's palace, a Louvre, a Hôtel de Saint-Paul was then, a city within a city. From the tower where we are placed, the Hôtel St. Paul, almost half hidden by the four great houses of which we have just spoken, was still very considerable and very marvellous to see. One could there distinguish, very well, though cleverly united with the principal building by long galleries, decked with painted glass and slender columns, the three hôtels which Charles V had amalgamated with his palace. The Hôtel du Petit Musée, with the airy balustrade which formed a graceful border to its roof. The Hôtel of the Abbé de Saint-Maur, having the vanity of a stronghold, a great tower, machicolations, loopholes, iron gratings, and over the large Saxon door the armorial bearings of the Abbé between the two mortices of the drawbridge. The Hôtel of the Comte d'Etampes, whose donjon keep, ruined at its summit, was rounded and notched like a coxcomb. Here and there 3 or 4 ancient oaks, forming a tuft together like enormous cauliflowers. Gambols of swans in the clear water of the fish-ponds, all in folds of light and shade. Many courtyards of which one beheld picturesque bits. The Hôtel of the Lion, with its low pointed arches on short Saxon pillars, its iron gratings and its perpetual roar. Shooting up above the whole, the scale-ornamented spire of the Ave Maria. On the left, the house of the Provost of Paris, flanked by 4 small towers, delicately grooved in the middle. At the extremity, the Hôtel St. Paul, properly speaking, with its multiplied facades, its successive enrichments from the time of Charles V, the hybrid excrescences with which the fancy of the architects had loaded it during the last 2 centuries, with all the apses of its chapels, all the gables of its galleries, 1,000 weathercocks for the 4 winds, and its 2 lofty contiguous towers, whose conical roof, surrounded by battlements at its base, looked like those pointed caps which have their edges turned up. Continuing to mount the stories of this amphitheatre of palaces spread out afar upon the ground, after crossing a deep ravine hollowed out of the roofs in the town, which marked the passage of the Rue Saint-Antoine, the eye reached the house of Angoulême, a vast construction of many epochs, where there were perfectly new and very white parts, which melted no better into the whole than a red patch on a blue doublet. Nevertheless, the remarkably pointed and lofty roof of the modern palace, bristling with carved eaves, covered with sheets of lead, where coiled 1,000 fantastic arabesques of sparkling incrustations of gilded bronze. That roof, so curiously damascened, darted upwards gracefully from the midst of the brown ruins of the ancient edifice, whose huge and ancient towers, rounded by age like casks, sinking together with old age, and rending themselves from top to bottom, resembled great bellies unbuttoned. Behind rose the forest of spires of the Palais de Tournelle. Not a view in the world, either at Chambord or at the Alhambra, is more magic, more aerial, more enchanting than that thicket of spires, tiny bell towers, chimneys, weather vanes, winding staircases, lanterns through which the daylight makes its way, which seem to cut out at a blow pavilions, spindle-shaped turrets, or as they were called then, tournelles, all differing in form, in height, and attitude. One would have pronounced it a gigantic stone chessboard. To the right of the tournelle, that truss of enormous towers, black as ink, running into each other and tied, as it were, by a circular moat. That donjon keep, much more pierced with loopholes than with windows. That drawbridge, always raised. That portcullis, always lowered, is the Bastille. Those sorts of black beaks which project from between the battlements, and which you take from a distance to be cave-spouts, are cannons. Beneath them, at the foot of the formidable edifice, behold the Porte Saint-Antoine buried between its 2 towers. Beyond the Tournelle, as far as the wall of Charles V, spread out, with rich compartments of verdure and of flowers, a velvet carpet of cultivated land and royal parks, in the midst of which one recognized by its labyrinth of trees and alleys the famous Daedalus garden which Louis XI had given to Poitiers. The doctor's observatory rose above the labyrinth like a great isolated column, with a tiny house for a capital. Terrible astrologies took place in that laboratory. There today is the Place Royale. As we have just said, the quarter of the palace, of which we have just endeavored to give the reader some idea by indicating only the chief points, filled the angle which Charles V's wall made with the Seine on the east. The center of the town was occupied by a pile of houses for the populace. It was there, in fact, that the 3 bridges disgorged upon the right bank, and the bridges led to the building of houses rather than palaces. That congregation of bourgeois habitations, pressed together like cells in a hive, had a beauty of its own. It is with the roofs of a capital as with the waves of the sea. They are grand. First, the streets, crossed and entangled, forming 100 amusing figures in the block. Around the marketplace it was like a star with 1,000 rays. The rues Saint-Denis and Saint-Martin, with their innumerable ramifications, rose one after the other, like trees intertwining their branches. And then the tortuous lines, the rues de la Plâtrerie, de la Verrerie, de la Tisserandierie, etc., meandered over all. There were also fine edifices which pierced the petrified undulations of that sea of gables. At the head of the Pont aux Changeurs, behind which one beheld the Seine foaming beneath the wheels of the Pont aux Meuniers, there was the Chalalet, no longer a Roman tower, as under Julian the Apostate, but a feudal tower of the 13th century, and of a stone so hard that the pickaxe could not break away so much as the thickness of the fist in a space of 3 hours. There was the rich square bell tower of Saint Jacques de la Boucherie, with its angles all frothing with carvings, already admirable, although it was not finished in the 15th century. It lacked, in particular, the 4 monsters, which, still perched today on the corners of its roof, have the air of so many sphinxes who are propounding to New Paris the riddle of the ancient Paris. Réau, the sculptor, only placed them in position in 1526, and received 20 francs for his pains. There was the Maison aux Piliers, the Pillar House, opening upon the Place de Grève, of which we have given the reader some idea. There was Saint-Gervais, which a front in good taste has since spoiled. Sainte-Marie, whose ancient pointed arches were still almost round arches. Saint-Jean, whose magnificent spire was proverbial. There were 20 other monuments which did not disdain to bury their wonders in that chaos of black, deep, narrow streets. Add the crosses of carved stone, more lavishly scattered through the squares than even the gibbets. The Cemetery of the Innocents, whose architectural wall could be seen in the distance above the roofs. The Pillory of the Markets, whose top was visible between 2 chimneys of the Rue de la Cossonnerie. The ladder of the Quai du Trahoir, in its square always black with people. The circular buildings of the Wheat Mart. The fragments of Philippe Augustus's ancient wall, which could be made out here and there, drowned among the houses, its towers gnawed by ivy, its gates in ruins, with crumbling and deformed stretches of wall. The quay, with its 1,000 shops, and its bloody knackers' yards. The Seine, encumbered with boats, from the Port-au-Foin to Port-l'Evêque, and you will have a confused picture of what the central trapezium of the town was like in 1482. With these 2 quarters, one of hotel, the other of houses, the third feature of aspect presented by the city was a long zone of abbeys, which bordered it in nearly the whole of its circumference, from the rising to the setting sun, and behind the circle of fortifications which hemmed in Paris formed a second interior enclosure of convents and chapels. Thus, immediately adjoining the Parc des Tournelles, between the Rue Saint-Antoine and the Vieille Rue du Temple, there stood Sainte Catherine, with its immense cultivated lands, which were terminated only by the wall of Paris. Between the old and the new Rue du Temple there was the Temple, a sinister group of towers, lofty, erect, and isolated in the middle of a vast battlement enclosure. Between the Rue Neuve du Temple and the Rue Saint-Martin there was the Abbey of Saint-Martin, in the midst of its gardens, a superb fortified church, whose girdle of towers, whose diadem of bell towers, yielded in force and splendor only to Saint-Germain-des-Prés. Between the Rue Saint-Martin and the Rue Saint-Denis spread the enclosure of the Trinité. Lastly, between the Rue Saint-Denis and the Rue Montorgueil stood the Fillet-Dieu. On one side, the rotting roofs and unpaved enclosure of the Cour des Miracles could be descried. It was the sole profane ring which was linked to that devout chain of convents. Finally, the fourth compartment, which stretched itself out in the agglomeration of the roofs on the right bank, and which occupied the western angle of the enclosure and the banks of the river downstream, was a fresh cluster of palaces and hotels pressed close about the base of the Louvre. This old Louvre of Philippe Augustus, that immense edifice, whose great tower rallied about it 23 chief towers, not to reckon the lesser towers, seemed from a distance to be enshrined in the Gothic roofs of the Hôtel d'Alençon and the Petit Bourbon. This hydra of towers, giant guardian of Paris, with its 24 heads, always erect, with its monstrous haunches, loaded or scaled with slates, and all streaming with metallic reflections, terminated with wonderful effect the configuration of the town towards the west. Thus, an immense block, which the Romans called Iusula, or island, of bourgeois houses, flanked on the right and the left by 2 blocks of palaces, crowned, the one by the Louvre, the other by the Tournelle, bordered on the north by a long girdle of abbeys and cultivated enclosures, all amalgamated and melted together in one view. Upon these thousands of edifices, whose tiled and slated roofs outlined upon each other so many fantastic chains, the bell towers, tattooed, fluted, and ornamented with twisted bands, of the 44 churches on the right bank, myriads of cross-streets, for boundary on one side an enclosure of lofty walls with square towers, that of the university had round towers, on the other the Seine, cut by bridges, and bearing on its bosom a multitude of boats. Behold the town of Paris in the 15th century. Beyond the walls, several suburban villages pressed close about the gates, but less numerous and more scattered than those of the university. Behind the Bastille there were 20 hovels clustered round the curious sculptures of the Croix Vauban and the flying buttresses of the Abbey of Saint-Antoine-des-Champs. Then Popincourt, lost amid wheat-fields. Then La Courtie, a merry village of wine-shops. The hamlet of Saint-Laurent, with its church, whose bell-tower, from afar, seemed to add itself to the pointed towers of the Porte Saint-Martin. The Faubourg Saint-Denis, with the vast enclosure of Saint-Ladre. Beyond the Montmartre gate, the Grange Batelière, encircled with white walls. Behind it, with its chalky slopes, Montmartre, which had then almost as many churches as windmills, and which has kept only the windmills, for society no longer demands anything but bread for the body. Lastly, beyond the Louvre, the Faubourg Saint-Honoré, already considerable at that time, could be seen stretching away into the fields, and Petit Breton gleaming green, and the Marché aux Pourceaux spreading abroad, in whose centre swelled the horrible apparatus used for boiling counterfeiters. Between La Courtie and Saint Laurent, your eye had already noticed, on the summit of an eminence crouching amid desert plains, a sort of edifice which resembled from a distance a ruined colonnade, mounted upon a basement with its foundation laid bare. This was neither a Parthenon nor a temple of the Olympian Jupiter. It was Montfaucon. Now, if the enumeration of so many edifices, summary as we have endeavored to make it, has not shattered in the reader's mind the general image of old Paris, as we have constructed it, we will recapitulate it in a few words. In the center, the island of the city, resembling as to form an enormous tortoise, and throwing out its bridges with tiles for scales, like legs from beneath its grey shell of roofs. On the left, the monolithic trapezium, firm, dense, bristling, of the university. On the right, the vast semicircle of the town, much more intermixed with gardens and monuments. The 3 blocks, city, university, and town, marbled with innumerable streets. Across all, the Seine, foster mother Seine, as says Father de Breuil, blocked with islands, bridges, and boats. All about an immense plain, patched with 1,000 sorts of cultivated plots, sown with fine villages. On the left, Issy, Vanvray, Vaugirard, Montrouge, Gentilly, with its round tower and its square tower, etc. On the right, 20 others, from Conflans to Ville-l'Evêque. On the horizon, a border of hills arranged in a circle like the rim of the basin. Finally, far away to the east, Vincennes and its 7 quadrangular towers. To the south, Bicêtre and its pointed turrets. To the north, Saint Denis and its spire. To the west, Saint Cloud and its dungeon keep. Such was the Paris which the ravens, who lived in 1482, beheld from the summits of the towers of Notre Dame. Nevertheless, Voltaire said of this city that, before Louis XIV, it possessed but 4 fine monuments: the Dome of the Sorbonne, the Val de Grace, the modern Louvre, and I know not what the 4th was, the Luxembourg perhaps. Fortunately, Voltaire was the author of Candide in spite of this, and in spite of this he is, among all the men who have followed each other in the long series of humanity, the one who has best possessed the diabolical laugh. Moreover, this proves that one can be a fine genius, and yet understand nothing of an art to which one does not belong. Did not Molière imagine that he was doing Raphael and Michelangelo a very great honor by calling them those Mignards of their age? Let us return to Paris and to the 15th century. It was not then merely a handsome city. It was a homogeneous city, an architectural and historical product of the Middle Ages, a chronicle in stone. It was a city formed of 2 layers only, the Romanesque layer and the Gothic layer, for the Roman layer had disappeared long before, with the exception of the hot baths of Julian, where it still pierced through the thick crust of the Middle Ages. As for the Celtic layer, no specimens were any longer to be found, even when sinking wells. 50 years later, when the Renaissance began to mingle with this unity which was so severe and yet so varied, the dazzling luxury of its fantasies and systems, its debasements of Roman round arches, Greek columns, and Gothic bases, its sculpture which was so tender and so ideal, its peculiar taste for arabesques and acanthus leaves, its architectural paganism, contemporary with Luther, Paris was perhaps still more beautiful, although less harmonious to the eye and to the thought. But this splendid moment lasted only for a short time. The Renaissance was not impartial. It did not content itself with building. It wished to destroy. It is true that it required the room. Thus Gothic Paris was complete only for a moment. Saint-Jacques de la Boucherie had barely been completed when the demolition of the old Louvre was begun. After that, the great city became more disfigured every day. Gothic Paris, beneath which Roman Paris was effaced in its turn. But can anyone say what Paris has replaced it? There is the Paris of Catherine de Medicis at the Tuileries, the Paris of Henri II at the Hôtel de Ville, two edifices still in fine taste. The Paris of Henri IV at the Place Royale, facades of brick with stone corners and slated roofs, tri-colored houses. The Paris of Louis XIII at the Val de Grace, a crushed and squat architecture, with vaults like basket handles, and something indescribably pot-bellied in the column and thick-set in the dome. The Paris of Louis XIV in the Invalides, grand, rich, gilded, cold. The Paris of Louis XV in Saint-Sulpice, volutes, knots of ribbon, clouds, vermicelli, and chicory leaves, all in stone. The Paris of Louis XVI in the Pantheon, St. Peter of Rome, badly copied. The edifice is awkwardly heaped together, which has not amended its lines. The Paris of the Republic in the School of Medicine, a poor Greek and Roman taste, which resembles the Colosseum or the Parthenon as the Constitution of the year 3 resembles the laws of Minos. It is called in architecture the Messidor taste. The Paris of Napoleon and the Place Vendôme. This one is sublime, a column of bronze made of cannons. The Paris of the Restoration at the Bourse, a very white colonnade supporting a very smooth frieze. The whole is square and cost 20 millions. To each of these characteristic monuments there is attached by a similarity of taste, fashion, and attitude a certain number of houses scattered about in different quarters, and which the eyes of the connoisseur easily distinguishes and furnishes with a date. When one knows how to look, one finds the spirit of a century, and the physiognomy of a king, even in the knocker on a door. The Paris of the present day has, then, no general physiognomy. It is a collection of specimens of many centuries, and the finest have disappeared. The capital grows only in houses, and what houses! At the rate at which Paris is now proceeding, it will renew itself every 50 years. Thus, the historical significance of its architecture is being effaced every day. Monuments are becoming rarer and rarer, and one seems to see them gradually engulfed by the flood of houses. Our fathers had a Paris of stone. Our sons will have one of plaster. So far as the modern monuments of New Paris are concerned, we would gladly be excused from mentioning them. It is not that we do not admire them as they deserve. The Saint Geneviève of M. Soufflot is certainly the finest Savoy cake that has ever been made in stone. The Palace of the Legion of Honor is also a very distinguished bit of pastry. The dome of the Wheat Market is an English jockey cap on a grand scale. The towers of Saint-Sulpice are two huge clarinets, and the form is as good as any other. The telegraph, contorted and grimacing, forms an admirable accident upon their roofs. Saint Roch has a door which, for magnificence, is comparable only to that of Saint Thomas d'Aquin. It has also a crucifixion in high relief in a cellar, with a sun of gilded wood. These things are fairly marvelous. The lantern of the labyrinth of the Jardin des Plantes is also very ingenious. As for the Palace of the Bourse, which is Greek as to its colonnade, Roman in the round arches of its doors and windows, of the Renaissance by virtue of its flattened vault, it is indubitably a very correct and very pure monument. The proof is that it is crowned with an attic, such as was never seen in Athens, a beautiful, straight line, gracefully broken here and there by stovepipes. Let us add that if it is according to rule that the architecture of a building should be adapted to its purpose in such a manner that this purpose shall be immediately apparent from the mere aspect of the building, one cannot be too much amazed at a structure which might be indifferently. The palace of a king, a chamber of communes, a town hall, a college, a riding school, an academy, a warehouse, a courthouse, a museum, a barracks, a sepulchre, a temple, or a theater. However, it is an exchange. An edifice ought to be, moreover, suitable to the climate. This one is evidently constructed expressly for our cold and rainy skies. It has a roof almost as flat as roofs in the East, which involve sweeping the roof in winter when it snows, and of course roofs are made to be swept. As for its purpose, of which we just spoke, it fulfills it to a marvel. It is a Bourse in France as it would have been a temple in Greece. It is true that the architect was at a good deal of trouble to conceal the clock face, which would have destroyed the purity of the fine lines of the façade, but on the other hand we have that colonnade which circles round the edifice, and under which, on days of high religious ceremony, the theories of the stockbrokers and the courtiers of the commerce can be developed so majestically. These are very superb structures. Let us add a quantity of fine, amusing, and varied streets, like the Rue de Rivoli, and I do not despair of Paris presenting to the eye, when viewed from a balloon, that richness of line, that opulence of detail, that diversity of aspect, that grandiose something in the simple and unexpected in the beautiful, which characterizes a checkerboard. However admirable as the Paris of today may seem to you, reconstruct the Paris of the 15th century, call it up before you in thought. Look at that sky athwart that surprising forest of spires, towers, and belfries, spread out in the center of the city, tear away at the point of the islands, fold at the arches of the bridges, the Seine, with its broad green and yellow expanses, more variable than the skin of a serpent. Project clearly against an azure horizon the Gothic profile of this ancient Paris. Make its contour float in a winter's mist which clings to its numerous chimneys. Drown it in profound night and watch the odd play of lights and shadows in that somber labyrinth of edifices. Cast upon it a ray of light which shall vaguely outline it and cause to emerge from the fog the great heads of the towers. Or take that black silhouette again, enliven with shadow the thousand acute angles of the spires and gables, and make it start out more toothed than a shark's jaw against a copper-colored western sky, and then compare. And if you wish to receive of the ancient city an impression with which the modern one can no longer furnish you, climb, on the morning of some grand festival beneath the rising sun of Easter or of Pentecost, climb upon some elevated point whence you command the entire capital, and be present at the awakening of the chimes. Behold, at a signal given from heaven, for it is the sun which gives it, all those churches quiver simultaneously. First come scattered strokes, running from one church to another, as when musicians give warning that they are about to begin. Then, all at once, behold! For it seems at times as though the ear also possessed a sight of its own. Behold, rising from each bell tower, something like a column of sound, a cloud of harmony. First, the vibration of each bell mounts straight upwards, pure and, so to speak, isolated from the others, into the splendid morning sky. Then, little by little, as they swell, they melt together, mingle, are lost in each other, and amalgamate in a magnificent concert. It is no longer anything but a mass of sonorous vibrations, incessantly sent forth from the numerous belfries, floats, undulates, bounds, whirls over the city, prolongs far beyond the horizon the deafening circle of its oscillations. Nevertheless, this sea of harmony is not chaos. Great and profound as it is not lost in its transparency. You behold the windings of each group of notes which escapes from the belfries. You can follow the dialogue, by turns grave and shrill, of the treble and the bass. You can see the octaves leap from one tower to another. You watch them spring forth, winged, light, and whistling from the silver bell, to fall, broken and limping from the bell of wood. You admire in their midst the rich gamut which incessantly ascends and reascends the 7 bells of Saint Eustache. You see light and rapid notes running across it, executing 3 or 4 luminous zigzags, and vanishing like flashes of lightning. Yonder is the Abbey of Saint Martin, a shrill, cracked singer. Here the gruff and gloomy voice of the Bastille. At the other end, the great tower of the Louvre, with its bass. The royal chime of the palace scatters on all sides, and without relaxation resplendent trills, upon which fall, at regular intervals, the heavy strokes from the belfry of Notre Dame, which makes them sparkle like the anvil under the hammer. At intervals you behold the passage of sounds of all forms which come from the triple peal of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. Then again, from time to time, this mass of sublime noises opens and gives passage to the beats of the Ave Maria, which bursts forth and sparkles like an aigrette of stars. Below, in the very depths of the concert, you confusedly distinguish the interior chanting of the churches, which exhales through the vibrating pores of their vaulted roofs. Assuredly, this is an opera which it is worth the trouble of listening to. Ordinarily, the noise which escapes from Paris by day is the city speaking. By night, it is the city breathing. In this case, it is the city singing. Lend an ear, then, to this concert of bell-towers. Spread over all the murmur of 500,000 men, the eternal plaint of the river, the infinite breathings of the wind, the grave and distant quartet of the 4 forests arranged upon the hills, on the horizon like immense stacks of organ-pipes. Extinguish, as in a half-shade, all that is too hoarse and too shrill about the center chime, and say whether you know anything in the world more rich and joyful, more golden, more dazzling than this tumult of bells and chimes, than this furnace of music, than these 10,000 brazen voices chanting simultaneously in the flutes of stone, 300 feet high, than this city which is no longer anything but an orchestra, than this symphony which produces the noise of a tempest. End of Book 3, Chapter 2. Book 4, Chapter 1 of The Hunchback of Notre Dame, by Victor Hugo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 4, Chapter 1. Good Souls. 16 years previous to the epoch when this story takes place, one fine morning, on Quasimodo Sunday, a living creature had been deposited, after Mass, in the church of Notre Dame, on the wooden bed securely fixed in the vestibule on the left, opposite that great image of Saint Christopher, which the figure of Messire Antoine des Essarts, Chevalier, carved in stone, had been gazing at on his knees since 1413, when they took it into their heads to overthrow the saint and the faithful follower. Upon this bed of wood it was customary to expose foundlings for public charity. Whoever cared to take them did so. In front of the wooden bed was a copper basin for alms. The sort of living being which lay upon that plank on the morning of Quasimodo, in the year of the Lord 1467, appeared to excite to a high degree the curiosity of the numerous group which had congregated about the wooden bed. The group was formed for the most part of the fair sex. Hardly anyone was there except old women. In the first row, and among those who were most bent over the bed, 4 were noticeable, who, from their grey cagoulets, a sort of cassock, were recognizable as attached to some devout sisterhood. I do not see why history has not transmitted to posterity the names of these 4 discreet and venerable damsels. They were Agnes la Hermée, Jeanne de la Tarmée, Henriette la Gautier, Gonchère la Violette, all 4 widows, all 4 dames of the chapel Etienne-Audry, who had quitted their house with the permission of their mistress, and in conformity with the statutes of Pierre d'Ailly, in order to come and hear the sermon. However, if these good Audriettes were, for the moment, complying with the statutes of Pierre d'Ailly, they certainly violated with joy those of Michel de Brache and the Cardinal of Pisa, which so inhumanly enjoined silence upon them. "What is this, sister?" said Agnes to Gauchère, gazing at the little creature exposed, which was screaming and writhing on the wooden bed, terrified by so many glances. "What is to become of us?" said Jehan, if that is the way children are made now." "I'm not learned in the matter of children," resumed Agnes, "but it must be a sin to look at this one." "'Tis not a child, Agnes." "'Tis an abortion of a monkey," remarked Gaucher. "'Tis a miracle," interposed Henriette Lagoutier. "Then," remarked Agnes, "it is the third since the Sunday of the Loitare, for in less than a week we had the miracle of the Mocker of the Pilgrims divinely punished by Notre Dame d'Aubervilliers, and that was the second miracle within a month." "This pretended foundling is a real monster of abomination," resumed Jehan. "He yells loud enough to deafen a chanter," continued Gaucher. "Hold your tongue, you little howler." "To think that Monsieur of Rheims sent this enormity to Monsieur of Paris," added Lagoutier, clasping her hands. "I imagine," said Agnes La Hermée, "that it is a beast, an animal, the fruit of a Jew and a sow, something not Christian, in short, which ought to be thrown into the fire, or into the water." "I really hope," resumed Lagoutier, "that nobody will apply for it." "Ah, good heavens!" exclaimed Agnes. "Those poor nurses yonder in the Foundling Asylum, which forms the lower end of the lane as you go to the river, just beside Monseigneur the Bishop. What if this little monster were to be carried to them to suckle? I'd rather give suck to a vampire." "How innocent that poor La Hermée is," resumed Jehan. "Don't you see, sister, that this little monster is at least 4 years old, and that he would have less appetite for your breast than for a turnspit?" The little monster, we should find it difficult ourselves to describe him otherwise, was in fact not a newborn child. It was a very angular and very lively little mass, imprisoned in its linen sack, stamped with the cipher of Messire Guillaume Chartier, then Bishop of Paris, with a head projecting. That head was deformed enough. One beheld only a forest of red hair, one eye, a mouth, and teeth. The eye wept, the mouth cried, and the teeth seemed to ask only to be allowed to bite. The whole struggled in the sack, to the great consternation of the crowd, which increased and was renewed incessantly around it. Dame Aloise de Gondelaurier, a rich and noble woman, who held by the hand a pretty girl about 5 or 6 years of age, and dragged a long veil about, suspended to the golden horn of her headdress, halted as she passed the wooden bed, and gazed for a moment at the wretched creature, while her charming little daughter, Fleur-de-Lis de Gondelaurier, spelled out with her tiny, pretty finger the permanent inscription attached to the wooden bed: "Foundlings." "Really," said the dame, turning away in disgust, "I thought that they only exposed children here." She turned her back, throwing into the basin a silver florin, which rang among the liards and made the poor goodwives of the chapel of Etienne Audry open their eyes. A moment later, the grave and learned Robert Mistricourt, the king's protonotary, passed, with an enormous missal under one arm, and his wife on the other, Damoiselle Guillemette la Maresse, having thus by his side his 2 regulators, spiritual and temporal. "Foundling," he said, after examining the object. "Found, apparently, on the banks of the river Phlegethon." "One can only see one eye," observed Damoiselle Guillemette. "There is a wart on the other." "It is not a wart," returned Master Robert Mistricourt. "It is an egg, which contains another demon exactly similar, who bears another little egg which contains another devil, and so on." "How do you know that?" asked Guillemette la Maresse. "I know it pertinently," replied the protonotary. "Monsieur le protonotary," asked Gaucher, "what do you prognosticate of this pretended foundling?" "The greatest misfortunes," replied Mistricourt. "Ah, good heavens!" said an old woman among the spectators. "And that, besides our having had a considerable pestilence last year, and that they say that the English are going to disembark in a company at Harfleur. Perhaps that will prevent the Queen from coming to Paris in the month of September, interposed another. "Trade is so bad already." "My opinion is," exclaimed Jehan de la Torme, "that it would be better for the louts of Paris if this little magician were put to bed on a faggot than on a plank." "A fine, flaming faggot," added the old woman. "It would be more prudent," said Mr. Coe. For several minutes a young priest had been listening to the reasoning of the Haudriettes and the sentences of the notary. He had a severe face, with a large brow, a profound glance. He thrust the crowd silently aside, scrutinized the little magician, and stretched out his hand upon him. It was high time, for all the devotees had already licked their chops over the fine, flaming faggot. "I adopt this child," said the priest. He took it in his cassock and carried it off. The spectators followed him with frightened glances. A moment later he had disappeared through the red door which then led from the church to the cloister. When the first surprise was over, Jehan de la Tarme bent down to the ear of La Gautier. "I told you, sister, that young clerk, Monsieur Claude Frollo, is a sorcerer." End of Book 4, Chapter 1. Book 4, Chapter 2 of The Hunchback of Notre Dame by Victor Hugo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 4, Chapter 2 Claude Frollo. In fact, Claude Frollo was no common person. He belonged to one of those middle-class families which were called, indifferently, in the impertinent language of the last century, the high bourgeois, or the petty nobility. This family had inherited from the brothers Paclet the fief of Tirchapet, which was dependent upon the Bishop of Paris, and whose 21 houses had been in the 13th century the object of so many suits before the official. As possessor of this fief, Claude Frollo was one of the 27 seigneurs keeping claim to a manor in fee in Paris and its suburbs. And for a long time his name was to be seen inscribed in this quality, between the Hôtel de Tancarville, belonging to Master Francois Leray, and the College of Tours, in the records deposited at Saint-Martin-des-Champs. Claude Frollo had been destined from infancy by his parents to the ecclesiastical profession. He had been taught to read in Latin. He had been trained to keep his eyes on the ground and to speak low. While still a child, his father had cloistered him in the College of Torchi in the university. There it was that he had grown up, on the Missal and the Lexicon. Moreover, he was a sad, grave, serious child, who studied ardently and learned quickly. He never uttered a loud cry in recreation hour, mixed but little in the bacchanals of the Rue de Fouarre, did not know what it was to dari alapas et capillos laniare, and cut no figure in that revolt of 1463, which the annalists register gravely under the title of the Sixth Trouble of the University. He seldom rallied the poor students of Montaigu on the Capettes, from which they derived their name, or the bursars of the College of Dormans on their shaved tonsure, and their surtout, parti-coloured of bluish-green, blue, and violet cloth, azurini coloris et bruni, as says the charter of the Cardinal des Quatre Couronnes. On the other hand, he was assiduous at the great and the small schools of the Rue Saint-Jean-de-Beauvais. The first pupil whom the Abbé de Saint-Pierre-de-Val, at the moment of beginning his reading on canon law, always perceived, glued to a pillar of the school Saint-Vendregecile, opposite his rostrum, was Claude Frollo, armed with his horn ink-bottle, biting his pen, scribbling on his threadbare knee, and in winter blowing on his fingers. The first auditor whom Messire Mildillier, doctor in decretals, saw arrive every Monday morning, all breathless, at the opening of the gates of the school of the Chef Saint-Denis, was Claude Frollo. Thus, at 16 years of age, the young clerk might have held his own, in mystical theology, against a father of the Church, in canonical theology against a father of the councils, in scholastic theology against a doctor of the Sorbonne. Theology conquered, he had plunged into decretals. From the Master of Sentences he had passed to the Capitularies of Charlemagne, and he had devoured in succession, in his appetite for science, decretals upon decretals, those of Theodore, Bishop of Hispalis, those of Bouchard, Bishop of Worms, those of Yves, Bishop of Chartres. Next, the Decretal of Gratian, which succeeded the Capitularies of Charlemagne. Then the collection of Gregory the Ninth. Then the Epistle of Superspecula of Honorius III. He rendered clear and familiar to himself that vast and tumultuous period of civil law and canon law in conflict and at strife with each other in the chaos of the Middle Ages, a period which Bishop Theodore opens in 618 and which Pope Gregory closes in 1227. Decretals digested, he flung himself upon medicine, on the liberal arts. He studied the science of herbs, the science of unguents. He became an expert in fevers and in contusions, in sprains and abscesses. Jacques Despard would have received him as a physician, Richard Helene as a surgeon. He also passed through all the degrees of licentiate, master, and doctor of arts. He studied the languages, Latin, Greek, Hebrew, a triple sanctuary then very little frequented. His was a veritable fever for acquiring and hoarding in the matter of science. At the age of 18 he had made his way through the 4 faculties. It seemed to the young man that life had but one sole object: learning. It was towards this epoch that the excessive heat of the summer of 1466 caused that grand outburst of the plague, which carried off more than 40,000 souls in the Vicomte of Paris, and among others, as Jean de Troyes states, Master Arnaud, astrologer to the king, who was a very fine man, both wise and pleasant. The rumor spread in the university that the Rue Tirechappe was especially devastated by the malady. It was there that Claude's parents resided, in the midst of their fief. The young scholar rushed in great alarm to the paternal mansion. When he entered it, he found that both father and mother had died on the preceding day. A very young brother of his, who was in swaddling clothes, was still alive, and crying, abandoned in his cradle. This was all that remained to Claude of his family. The young man took the child under his arm and went off in a pensive mood. Up to that moment he had lived only in science. He now began to live in life. This catastrophe was a crisis in Claude's existence. Orphaned, the eldest head of the family at the age of 19, he felt himself rudely recalled from the reveries of school to the realities of this world. Then, moved with pity, he was seized with passion and devotion towards that child, his brother. A sweet and strange thing was a human affection to him, who had hitherto loved his books alone. This affection developed to a singular point. In a soul so new, it was like a first love. Separated since infancy from his parents, whom he had hardly known, cloistered and immured, as it were, in his books, eager above all things to study and to learn, exclusively attentive up to that time to his intelligence, which broadened in science, to his imagination, which expanded in letters. The poor scholar had not yet had time to feel the place of his heart. This young brother, without mother or father, this little child which had fallen abruptly from heaven into his arms, made a new man of him. He perceived that there was something else in the world besides the speculations of the Sorbonne and the verses of Homer, that man needed affections, that life without tenderness and without love was only a set of dry, shrieking, and rending wheels. Only, he imagined, for he was at the age when illusions are as yet replaced only by illusions, that the affections of blood and family were the sole ones necessary, and that a little brother to love sufficed to fill an entire existence. He threw himself, therefore, into the love for his little Jehan with the passion of a character already profound, ardent, concentrated. That poor, frail creature, pretty, fair-haired, rosy, and curly. That orphan, with another orphan for his only support, touched him to the bottom of his heart. And, grave thinker as he was set to meditating upon Jehane with an infinite compassion. He kept watch and ward over him as over something very fragile and very worthy of care. He was more than a brother to the child, he became a mother to him. Little Jehane had lost his mother while he was still at the breast. Claude gave him to a nurse. Besides the fief of Tirchapey, he had inherited from his father the fief of Molan, which was a dependency of the square tower of Gentilly. It was a mill on a hill, near the Chateau of Winchestre, Bicetre. There was a miller's wife there who was nursing a fine child. It was not far from the university, and Claude carried the little Jehane to her in his own arms. From that time forth, feeling that he had a burden to bear, he took life very seriously. The thought of his little brother became not only his recreation, but the object of his studies. He resolved to consecrate himself entirely to a future for which he was responsible in the sight of God, and never to have any other wife, any other child than the happiness and fortune of his brother. Therefore, he attached himself more closely than ever to the clerical profession. His merits, his learning, his quality of immediate vassal of the Bishop of Paris, threw the doors of the Church wide open to him. At the age of 20, by special dispensation of the Holy See, he was a priest, and served as the youngest of the chaplains of Notre Dame, the altar which is called, because of the late Mass which is said there, Altari Pigrorum. There, plunged more deeply than ever in his dear books, which he quitted only to run for an hour to the fief of Moulin, this mixture of learning and austerity, so rare at his age, had promptly acquired for him the respect and admiration of the monastery. From the cloister his reputation as a learned man had passed to the people, among whom it had changed a little, a frequent occurrence at that time, into reputation as a sorcerer. It was at the moment when he was returning, on Quasimodo Day, from saying his Mass at the altar of the Lazy, which was by the side of the door leading to the nave on the right, near the image of the Virgin, that his attention had been attracted by the group of old women chattering around the bed for foundlings. Then it was that he approached the unhappy little creature, which was so hated and so menaced. That distress, that deformity, that abandonment, the thought of his young brother, the idea which suddenly occurred to him that if he were to die, his dear little Jehane might also be flung miserably on the plank for foundlings. All this had gone to his heart simultaneously. A great pity had moved in him, and he had carried off the child. When he removed the child from the sack, he found it greatly deformed, in very sooth. The poor little wretch had a wart on his left eye, his head placed directly on his shoulders, his spinal column was crooked, his breastbone prominent, and his legs bowed. But he appeared to be lively, and although it was impossible to say in what language he lisped, his cry indicated considerable force and health. Claude's compassion increased at the sight of his ugliness, and he made a vow in his heart to rear the child for the love of his brother, in order that, whatever might be the future faults of the little Jehane, he would have beside him that charity done for his sake. It was a sort of investment in good works, which he was effecting in the name of his young brother. It was a stock of good works which he wished to amass in advance for him, in case the little rogue should some day find himself short of that coin, the only sort which is received at the toll-bar of paradise. He baptized his adopted child, and gave him the name of Quasimodo, either because he desired thereby to mark the day when he had found him, or because he wished to designate by that name to what a degree the poor little creature was incomplete, and hardly sketched out. In fact, Quasimodo, blind, hunchbacked, knock-kneed, was only an almost. End of Book 4, Chapter 2. Book 4, Chapter 3 of The Hunchback of Notre Dame by Victor Hugo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 4, Chapter 3. Immanis Picoris Custos, Immanior Ipse. Now, in 1482, Quasimodo had grown up. He had become, a few years previously, the bell-ringer of Notre Dame, thanks to his father by adoption, Claude Frollo, who had become Archdeacon of Josey thanks to his suzerain, Messire Louis de Beaumont, who had become a bishop of Paris at the death of Guillaume Chartier in 1472, thanks to his patron, Olivier le Daim, barber to Louis XI, king by the grace of God. So Quasimodo was the ringer of the chimes of Notre Dame. In the course of time there had been formed a certain peculiarly intimate bond which united the ringer to the Church. Separated forever from the world by the double fatality of his unknown birth and his natural deformity, imprisoned from his infancy in that impassable double circle, the poor wretch had grown used to seeing nothing in this world beyond the religious walls which had received him under their shadow. Notre Dame had been to him successively, as he grew up and developed, the egg, the nest, the house, the country, the universe. There was certainly a sort of mysterious and pre-existing harmony between this creature and this church. When, still a little fellow, he had dragged himself tortuously and by jerks beneath the shadows of its vaults, he seemed, with his human face and his bestial limbs, the natural reptile of that humid and sombre pavement, upon which the shadow of the Romanesque capitals cast so many strange forms. Later on, the first time that he caught hold, mechanically, of the ropes to the towers and hung suspended from them, and set the bell to clanging, it produced upon his adopted father, Claude, the effect of a child whose tongue is unloosed and who begins to speak. It is thus that, little by little, developing always in sympathy with the cathedral, living there, sleeping there, hardly ever leaving it, subject every hour to the mysterious impress, he came to resemble it, he encrusted himself in it, so to speak, and became an integral part of it. His salient angles fitted into the retreating angles of the cathedral, if he may be allowed this figure of speech, and he seemed not only its inhabitant, but more than that, its natural tenant. One might almost say that he had assumed its form, as the snail takes on the form of its shell. It was his dwelling, his hole, his envelope. There existed between him and the old church so profound and instinctive sympathy, so many magnetic affinities, so many material affinities, that he adhered to it somewhat as a tortoise adheres to its shell. The rough and wrinkled cathedral was his shell. It is useless to warn the reader not to take literally all the similes which we are obliged to employ here, to express the singular, symmetrical, direct, almost consubstantial union of a man and an edifice. It is equally unnecessary to state to what a degree that the whole cathedral was familiar to him, after so long and so intimate a cohabitation. That dwelling was peculiar to him. It had no depths to which Quasimodo had not penetrated, no height which he had not scaled. He often climbed many stones up the front, aided solely by the uneven points of the carving. The towers, on whose exterior surface he was frequently seen clambering, like a lizard gliding along a perpendicular wall, those two gigantic twins, so lofty, so menacing, so formidable, possessed for him neither vertigo, nor terror, nor shocks of amazement. To see them so gentle under his hand, so easy to scale, one would have said that he had tamed them. By dint of leaping, climbing, gambolling amid the abysses of the gigantic cathedral, he had become, in some sort, a monkey and a goat, like the Calabrian child who swims before he walks, and plays with the sea while still a babe. Moreover, it was not his body alone which seemed fashioned after the cathedral, but his mind also. In what condition was that mind? What bent had it contracted? What form had it assumed beneath that knotted envelope, in that savage life? This it would be hard to determine. Quasimodo had been born one-eyed, hunchbacked, lame. It was with great difficulty, and by dint of great patience, that Claude Frollo had succeeded in teaching him to talk. But a fatality was attached to the poor foundling. Bell-ringer of Notre Dame at the age of 14, a new infirmity had come to complete his misfortunes. The bells had broken the drums of his ears. He had become deaf. The only gate which nature had left wide open for him had been abruptly closed, and forever. In closing, it had cut off the only ray of joy and of light which still made its way into the soul of Quasimodo. His soul fell into profound night. The wretched being's misery became as incurable and as complete as his deformity. Let us add that his deafness rendered him to some extent dumb, for in order not to make others laugh, the very moment that he found himself to be deaf, he resolved upon a silence which he only broke when he was alone. He voluntarily tied that tongue which Claude Frollo had taken so much pains to unloose. Hence it came about that, when necessity constrained him to speak, his tongue was torpid, awkward, and like a door whose hinges had grown rusty. If now we were to try to penetrate to the soul of Quasimodo through that thick, hard rind, if we could sound the depths of that badly constructed organism, if it were granted to us to look with a torch behind those non-transparent organs, to explore the shadowy interior of that opaque creature, to elucidate his obscure corners, his absurd no-thoroughfares, and suddenly to cast a vivid light upon the soul enchained at the extremity of that cave, we should, no doubt, find the unhappy Psyche in some poor, cramped, and rickety attitude, like those prisoners beneath the leads of Venice, who grew old bent double in a stone box which was both too low and too short for them. It is certain that the mind becomes atrophied in a defective body. Quasimodo was barely conscious of a soul cast in his own image, moving blindly within him. The impressions of objects underwent a considerable refraction before reaching his mind. His brain was a peculiar medium. The ideas which passed through it issued forth completely distorted. The reflection which resulted from this refraction was necessarily divergent and perverted. Hence 1,000 optical illusions, 1,000 aberrations of judgment, 1,000 deviations which his thought strayed, now mad, now idiotic. The first effect of this fatal organization was to trouble the glance which he cast upon things. He received hardly any immediate perception of them. The external world seemed much farther away to him than it does to us. The second effect of his misfortune was to render him malicious. He was malicious, in fact, because he was savage. He was savage because he was ugly. There was logic in his nature, as there is in ours. His strength, so extraordinarily developed, was a cause of still greater malevolence. Malus puer robustus, says Hobbes. This injustice must, however, be rendered to him. Malevolence was not perhaps innate in him. From his very first steps among men he had felt himself, later on he had seen himself, spewed out, blasted, rejected. Human words were for him always a raillery or a malediction. As he grew up, he had found nothing but hatred around him. He had caught the general malevolence. He had picked up the weapon with which he had been wounded. After all, he turned his face towards men only with reluctance. His cathedral was sufficient for him. It was peopled with marble figures, kings, saints, bishops, who at least did not burst out laughing in his face, who gazed upon him only with tranquillity and kindliness. The other statues, those of the monsters and demons, cherished no hatred for him, Quasimodo. He resembled them too much for that. They seemed rather to be scoffing at other men. The saints were his friends and blessed him. The monsters were his friends and guarded him. So he held long communion with them. He sometimes passed whole hours crouching before one of these statues in solitary conversation with it. If anyone came, he fled like a lover surprised in his serenade. And the cathedral was not only society for him, but the universe and all nature beside. He dreamed of no other hedgerows than the painted windows, always in flower, no other shade than that of the foliage of stone which spread out, loaded with birds, in the tufts of the Saxon capitals, of no other mountains than the colossal towers of the church, of no other ocean than Paris, roaring at their bases. What he loved above all else in the maternal edifice, that which aroused his soul and made it open its poor wings, which kept it so miserably folded in its cavern, that which sometimes rendered him even happy, was the bells. He loved them, fondled them, talked to them, understood them. From the chime in the spire, over the intersection of the aisles in the nave, to the great bell of the front, he cherished a tenderness for them all. The central spire and the two towers were to him as three great cages, whose birds, reared by himself, sang for him alone. Yet it was these very bells which had made him deaf. But mothers often love best that child which has caused them the most suffering. It is true that their voice was the only one which he could still hear. On this score the big bell was his beloved. It was she whom he preferred out of all that family of noisy girls which bustled above him, on festival days. This bell was named Marie. She was alone in the southern tower, with her sister Jacqueline, a bell of lesser size, shut up in a smaller cage beside hers. This Jacqueline was so called from the name of the wife of Jean Montague, who had given it to the church, which had not prevented his going and figuring without his head at Montfaucon. In the second tower there were 6 other bells, and finally 6 smaller ones inhabited the belfry over the crossing, with the wooden bell, which rang only between after dinner on Good Friday and the morning of the day before Easter. So Quasimodo had 15 bells in his seraglio, but Big Marie was his favorite. No idea can be formed of his delight on days when the grand peal was sounded. At the moment when the Archdeacon dismissed him and said "Go," he mounted the spiral staircase of the clock tower faster than anyone else could have descended it. He entered perfectly breathless into the aerial chamber of the great bell. He gazed at her a moment, devoutly and lovingly. Then he gently addressed her and patted her with his hand, like a good horse, which is about to set out on a long journey. He pitied her for the trouble she was about to suffer. After these first caresses, he shouted to his assistants, placed in the lower story of the tower, to begin. They grasped the ropes, the wheel creaked, the enormous capsule of metal started slowly into motion. Quasimodo followed it with his glance and trembled. The first shock of the clapper and the brazen wall made the framework upon which it was mounted quiver. Quasimodo vibrated with the bell. "Va!" he cried, with a senseless burst of laughter. However, the great movement of the base was accelerated, and, in proportion as it described a wider angle, Quasimodo's eye opened also more and more widely, phosphoric and flaming. At length the grand peal began. The whole tower trembled. Woodwork, leads, cut stones all groaned at once, from the piles of the foundation to the trefoils of its summit. Then Quasimodo boiled and frothed. He went and came. He trembled from head to foot with the tower. The bell, furious, running riot, presented to the two walls of the tower alternately its brazen throat, whence escaped that tempestuous breath which is audible leagues away. Quasimodo stationed himself in front of this open throat. He crouched and rose with the oscillations of the bell, breathed in this overwhelming breath, gazed by turns at the deep place which swarmed with people 200 feet below him, and at that enormous brazen tongue which came, second after second, to howl in his ear. It was the only speech which he understood, the only sound which broke for him the universal silence. He swelled out in it as a bird does in the sun. All of a sudden, the frenzy of the bell seized upon him. His look became extraordinary. He lay in wait for the great bell as it passed, as a spider lies in wait for a fly, and flung himself abruptly upon it, with might and main. Then, suspended above the abyss, borne to and fro by the formidable swinging of the bell, he seized the brazen monster by the ear-laps, pressed it between both knees, spurred it on with his heels, and redoubled the fury of the peal with the whole shock and weight of his body. Meanwhile the tower trembled. He shrieked and gnashed his teeth, his red hair rose erect, his breast heaving like a bellows, his eye flashed flames, the monstrous bell neighed, panting beneath him. And then it was no longer the great bell of Notre Dame nor Quasimodo. It was a dream, a whirlwind, a tempest, dizziness mounted astride of noise. A spirit clinging to a flying crupper, a strange centaur, half man, half bell, a sort of horrible Astolphus, borne away upon a prodigious hippogriff of living bronze. The presence of this extraordinary being caused, as it were, a breath of life to circulate through the entire cathedral. It seemed as though there escaped from him, at least according to the growing superstitions of the crowd, a mysterious emanation which animated all the stones of Notre Dame, and made the deep bowels of the ancient church to palpitate. It sufficed for people to know that he was there, to make them believe that they beheld the 1,000 statues of the galleries and the fronts in motion. And the cathedral did indeed seem a docile and obedient creature beneath his hand. It waited on his will to raise its great voice. It was possessed and filled with Quasimodo, as with a familiar spirit. One would have said that he made the immense edifice breathe. He was everywhere about it. In fact, he multiplied himself on all points of the structure. Now one perceived with affright at the very top of one of the towers a fantastic dwarf climbing, writhing, crawling on all fours, descending outside above the abyss, leaping from projection to projection, and going to ransack the belly of some sculptured Gorgon. It was Quasimodo dislodging the crows. Again, in some obscure corner of the church, one came in contact with a sort of living chimera, crouching and scowling. It was Quasimodo engaged in thought. Sometimes one caught sight, upon a bell tower, of an enormous head and a bundle of disordered limbs, swinging furiously at the end of a rope. It was Quasimodo ringing vespers or the Angelus. Often, at night, a hideous form was seen wandering along the frail balustrade of carved lacework which crowns the towers and borders of the circumference of the apse. Again it was the hunchback of Notre Dame. Then, said the women of the neighborhood, the whole church took on something fantastic, supernatural, horrible. Eyes and mouths were open here and there. One heard the dogs, the monsters, and the gargoyles of stone, which keep watch night and day, with outstretched neck and open jaws, around the monstrous cathedral, barking. And, if it was a Christmas Eve, while the great bell, which seemed to emit the death rattle, summoned the faithful to the midnight mass, such an air was spread over the sombre façade that one would have declared that the grand portal was devouring the throng, and that the rose window was watching it. And all this came from Quasimodo. Egypt would have taken him for the god of this temple. The Middle Ages believed him to be its demon. He was, in fact, its soul. To such an extent was this disease that for those who know that Quasimodo existed, Notre Dame is today deserted, inanimate, dead. One feels that something has disappeared from it. That immense body is empty. It is a skeleton. The spirit has quitted it. One sees its place, and that is all. It is like a skull which still has holes for the eyes, but no longer sight. End of Book 4, Chapter 3. Book 4, Chapter 4 of The Hunchback of Notre Dame by Victor Hugo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 4, Chapter 4. The Dog and His Master. Nevertheless, there was one human creature whom Quasimodo accepted from his malice and from his hatred for others, and whom he loved even more, perhaps, than his cathedral. This was Claude Frollo. The matter was simple. Claude Frollo had taken him in, had adopted him, had nourished him, had reared him. When a little lad, it was between Claude Frollo's legs that he was accustomed to seek refuge, when the dogs and the children barked after him. Claude Frollo had taught him to talk, to read, to write. Claude Frollo had finally made him the bell-ringer. Now, to give the big bell in marriage to Quasimodo was to give Juliet to Romeo. Hence Quasimodo's gratitude was profound, passionate, boundless, and although the visage of his adopted father was often clouded or severe, although his speech was habitually curt, harsh, imperious, that gratitude never wavered for a single moment. The Archdeacon had in Quasimodo the most submissive slave, the most docile lackey, the most vigilant of dogs. When the poor bell-ringer became deaf, there had been established between him and Claude Frollo a language of signs, mysterious and understood by themselves alone. In this manner the Archdeacon was the sole human being with whom Quasimodo had preserved communication. He was in sympathy with but two things in this world, Notre Dame and Claude Frollo. There is nothing which can be compared with the empire of the Archdeacon over the bell-ringer, with the attachment of the bell-ringer for the Archdeacon. A sign from Claude and the idea of giving him pleasure would have sufficed to make Quasimodo hurl himself headlong from the summit of Notre Dame. It was a remarkable thing. All that physical strength which had reached in Quasimodo such an extraordinary development, and which was placed by him blindly at the disposition of another. There was in it, no doubt, filial devotion, domestic attachment. There was also the fascination of one spirit by another spirit. It was a poor, awkward, and clumsy organization which stood with lowered head and supplicating eyes before a lofty and profound, a powerful and superior intellect. Lastly, and above all, it was gratitude. Gratitude so pushed to its extremest limit that we do not know to what to compare it. This virtue is not one of those of which the finest examples are to be met with among men. We will say, then, that Quasimodo loved the Archdeacon as never a dog, never a horse, never an elephant loved his master. End of Book 4, Chapter 4.